afternoon. Welcome to the 7th Annual Real Symposium. I'm Christine Gregorak. I am a partner at the Real Estate Law Group and the co-chair of the Real Property Law Section Executive Committee. I'm also a member of SPIRE and am chairing this event with Elizabeth Youngblood from SPIRE. Every year, SPIRE and the Real Property Law Section co-produce this event with the intention of gathering the experts to come and talk to us about important issues that are facing the real estate industry. We've had a very eventful year, and we have several issues to talk about today, including our first panel is going to talk about innovations in several areas that may help fix the housing crisis. We're going to talk about the Trump administration's gutting of the EPA and rollback of environmental regulations and what that might mean to us. California wildfires, their impact. They've swept our state. There's been devastating impacts, but there are current efforts underway to address these impacts that are important to all of us. And then finally, the burgeoning cannabis industry and what that looks like in the context of the political landscape that involves Jeff Sessions. We anticipate a very lively discussion today and hope you participate in the dialogue. For those of you in the room today that are attorneys, you might not know this, but this is a historic time for California attorneys. As of January 1st, the Real Property Law Section, together with the 15 other bar sections in the California Lawyers Association, separated from the California Bar and created the California Lawyers Association. This happened just at the beginning of the year. The California Lawyers Association is already the second largest attorney bar in the country, second only to the ABA. We are responsible for putting on MCLE events, networking events, legal publications, and providing other lawyer services, all of the services that the sections have previously provided. The CLA is structured as a nonprofit private corporation, and as such, we are not encumbered by the bureaucracy that comes along with being part of a state agency. So what does this mean? Why do you care? What this means is that the Real Property Law Section can do an even better job bringing events like the Real Symposium to you and to better serve you. We're very excited for this opportunity, and we are welcoming and encouraging all real estate practitioners, not just lawyers, to join us. There's opportunity for everybody to become involved. If you have any questions regarding membership, please come talk to me. There's other executive committee members in this room. Come talk to them. We'd love to give you information. This is a very interesting time. A lot of other states are watching California to see what happens, and we're excited for the opportunity, and we know it's going to go great. So thank you to our sponsors. We can't put on this event without our sponsors. All of the sponsors are listed in your brochure and in the posters outside. Thanks for joining us on the farm today. Elizabeth Lambert's going to talk about SPIRE.
You can tell that Christine and I have known each other for a long time because she used my maiden name from 20, 30 years ago. No, I still use it. It's just a funny indication. My name's Elizabeth Youngblood. I am the executive director of an organization called Stanford Professionals in Real Estate, often known as SPIRE. We are affiliated with Stanford University. We are an alumni club. There are 220 alumni clubs around the world, and we are unique among that universe in that we are an independent nonprofit. We have our own 501c3 status and our own employees, which has provided us great latitude to undertake our work. We were founded in 2010 with the intention to help Stanford organically develop, we hope, a coherent real estate curriculum that crosses all of the disciplines across campus. Stanford hasn't historically been known for real estate in terms of research and teaching, yet it produces many names that you all know in the real estate industry. So SPIRE's, one of its main objectives is to help the university, as I said, establish a real estate curriculum and hopefully even a Stanford Center for Real Estate. More to come on that later this year. We also do alumni networking and education, as well as we help current students learn about the real estate industry while they're here on campus, whether they're undergrads or graduate students. If you'd like to get involved, I welcome you to join SPIRE. We are 2,500 members strong and growing rapidly across the United States. We produce a lot of fun events, and I think you're going to meet some nice people if you come join us. I particularly want to thank not only the sponsors for the Real Symposium, but also SPIRE sponsors. We just last year launched for the first time a corporate partnership program that has allowed us to undertake a new level of activities that we hadn't previously been able to. So I'm particularly thankful for our relationships with Alan Madkins and AEI Consultants and the Brando, and our very own Randy Miller of Rad Urban is one of our brand new sponsors, so he's here today as a speaker. And Randy, thank you for your support of SPIRE. His company's doing amazing work in the East Bay. I'd recommend you also get to know him. So thank you very much for your time. Christine really has exhibited an incredible amount of leadership for 3 years in a row in running Real. It's been a real treat for me to get to work with her, and I hope that you all will see the results of her hard work and effort today. Thank you.
So to introduce our first panel is Tori Galushi from Miller Star and Regalia. Tori's done a fantastic job organizing this panel. Thanks, Tori.
Thanks to everyone for being here this afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing our first moderator for our first panel, David Kleiman. David is the president and co-founder of D2 Realty Services, Inc., which has projects in both Illinois and California, including a recent project, a mixed-use building in Palo Alto, a 35-story condo project in Chicago, as well as a 250,000 square foot mixed-use project also in Chicago, which I understand houses the Miller Coors Brewing Company. It was also the recipient of the 2014 BOMA International Building of the Year Award. David also teaches at Stanford University. He's taught courses at the law school. He's also an adjunct professor at the Stanford Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He guest lectures at the GSB and also at the Stanford Center for Professional Development. He has a BS in psychology from the University of Illinois, a JD from Northwestern University, and is actively involved in the endowment of the Kleiman Public Interest Fellowship at Northwestern University. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Kleiman.
Slide through here. Thank you, Tori, and welcome everyone. Oops. Oh, maybe I don't need this. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. No. You need this. Okay, I think we're good. Yes, I'm seeing people, thank you, in the back of the room, shaking their head. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel, and I think you'll, especially as I introduce the panel, you'll be hearing and hopefully seeing, if we got the audio visuals correct, some really amazing innovations, design, construction, and fortunately for everyone from a legal standpoint. And I do think as much bad news as there is for housing in the Bay Area, that there's a lot of good news, and the folks sitting to my right are really at the forefront of solving the problem. What I'd like to do today is to spend about 10 minutes kind of introducing the nature of the exact problem that we have in the Bay Area housing-wise, and then also introducing the panelists and what they're going to talk about. It's my hope, if this goes according to plan, that during the presentation, I'm going to have you try to email me questions that come up, and I'll try to present those during the panel examination. If that doesn't work out well, and even if it does, I'm definitely going to leave time at the end of the panel for a mic to go around, or I guess the mics are set up for you to come up to in 2 locations and ask your questions. So please do. We want as much as possible to make this participatory. So sit back and relax and enjoy it. First, let me start with, let's see if this works. Okay, perfect. I'm going to show you a few slides that, and I do need to give thanks to my wife, who is the Chief Financial Officer of Essex Property Trust. Many of you probably know that's a very large multifamily company that's located in the Bay Area. And she has a research department, and you know, I was able to cherry pick among their amazing slides and doctor them a bit to make them really work well for this panel. So I want to pass along those thanks. But some of the most striking things that I saw as I went through those slides is we all know the Bay Area is exceptional. The wealth creation in the Bay Area, because of obviously tech and many other factors, is really incredible as it relates to everywhere else in the country. If you look at San Jose, which is largely captures the Silicon Valley effect, the per capita numbers, GDP, and the growth rates are just off the charts. By the way, I assume everyone can't? Oh, good, yeah, you can't read these. What that has done, obviously, is create a huge amount of demand for housing. And coupled with some other factors, which we will get into, that has created a massive housing imbalance. This really jumped out at me. Essex happens to be in really 3 locales. Obviously, we're focused on the center part of this chart, which shows Northern California. Between 2010 and 2017, 700,000 jobs were created in the Bay Area. Unfortunately, during that same time, 175,000 units of housing were created. If you assume generally that 2 people comprise a household, that's a massive imbalance. That means we're $175,000 negative on housing creation. That's a staggering number. If you think about the number of housing units that are built in the Bay Area in a given year, does anyone know what that is? I mean, it's in the low thousands. It's not very significant. Maybe it's 8 to 10, 12, in a good year, 15. People have said, oh, we'll get to 25 or 30. I don't think that's going to happen. So we have multiple years, in the absolute best case, of a housing imbalance. So obviously we enjoy a number of positive attributes. One of them is that is not that I'm at the age where my kids could live with me. I'm glad they don't. Martin and I were talking about this earlier. His son does not live with him, and I think we're in the minority. The number of 18 to 34-year-olds living at home is striking. I mean, there have been movies made about it, and that's for a reason. It's bad and it's getting worse. And that's because these people most of whom are gainfully employed cannot possibly afford to rent or even think about buying a house in the Bay Area. One of the things that's also pushing people in our direction is net migration in the United States. Net migration into California isn't the highest in the nation, but it's up there. You can see the dark states. Washington, Oregon are quite dark. There's a few others, but it's bad, and it's bad in California. This is a really interesting chart. Needs a little bit of interpretation. Household income growth versus rent growth. Household income is growing, and it's growing quite rapidly in the Bay Area, which is fantastic. The problem is that rent growth is growing faster. And if you look at San Francisco and San Jose on the left, there's a huge imbalance. I mean, you've got income growth on the one hand at nearly 6%, but housing growth less than 1%. What that means is lots of people with lots of money at the upper end who can afford to push rents and purchase home prices up but there's no housing for them. If you go onto Realtor.com or Zillow or anything and just pull up the entire Bay Area, there's very few red dots on any of those with available homes. There's just nothing on the market because nobody, first of all, nobody can sell their home because they have nowhere else to move. Unless they're retiring and moving out of the area, there's very few people moving. So it's a terrible, it's a good problem because it's such a great place. It's a terrible problem because, you know, it puts us in the situation we're in. Maybe the toughest thing about the Bay Area, I can tell you from just finishing a building that I didn't spend $300 a foot or $400 a foot, but $1,000 a foot to build in Palo Alto. It's the most expensive place to build in the United States, period. There's nowhere else worse unless you go outside the continental US. In other words, if you had a set of plans and you wanted to build something here and you took it to New York City, you'd get a discount. That's crazy. New York City is supposed to be the most expensive. Well, it isn't. The only place in the United States that's more expensive is Honolulu. And that's because everything that gets built there needs to go there on a ship. So, summarize. Highest GDP and GDP growth, huge housing imbalance, record housing demand from 18 to 34-year-olds, which is projected to increase, household income growth outpacing rent growth, and the highest construction costs. So it's no wonder we have a problem to solve today. The good news is we've got just the right team of folks sitting to my right to solve that problem, and I'm going to introduce them now. Oh, by the way, do make a note of my email address, which is, you probably have in the materials my last name, just add a 1 at stanford.edu, and we'll see if it works. I'm not promising, but I'm going to try to check my email during the presentation and pull up relevant questions as quickly as I can. And if not, of course, we'll do that at the end. So we want to make this a conversation, but I have found, because the slides from each one of today's panelists are very compelling, that I'm probably going to kind of go in order and then reach out to other members of the panel to fill in as need be. So our first panelist is Eric, and I don't want to mispronounce your last name. Baksek, okay.
Sorry, I have a Hungarian last name that's difficult to pronounce. I feel your pain.
From Alphabet Sidewalk Labs. You may not have heard of Alphabet Sidewalk Labs, but you probably heard of Alphabet, and there is a relationship there, as you'll see from one of the slides and how that works. Eric's title is Designer in Residence. His work explores the relationship between digital technologies and building scale fabrication. Those are a complicated set of words, but you'll understand what that means shortly. He feels that rethinking the construction process from design, materials, and methodologies is fundamental in our drive towards more sustainable and equitable urbanism. A former product designer at Google, interaction designer at Frog, and research fellow at MIT's Sensible Labs, or City Lab. He holds a master's degree from Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a bachelor degree in environmental science. Our second panelist is Randy Miller from, is it RAD or RAD? How do you like it pronounced?
Rad Urban.
Rad Urban, okay. He spent some time on this campus a few years back. He's president and CEO of Rad Urban, which is a vertically integrated design-build contractor, modular manufacturer. You will be amazed when you see what they do, and a real estate developer. He leads this company in its development and implementation of an industry-transforming industrialized building system and has general management responsibility for basically everything. He's the cheap cook and bottle washer. Rad Urban focuses on urban infill development, and in both, you'll see in both mid-rise and now high-rise, in this very seismic region. Upon completion, several of the buildings that he's working on will be the tallest modular buildings in North America. The first of these is scheduled to begin construction in mid-2018. Randy, as I mentioned, earned a BS in mechanical engineering from Berkeley and then an MS from Stanford in civil engineering, where our third panelist, Martin, resides. Martin Fisher is a professor of civil engineering, civil and environmental engineering at Stanford, and a senior fellow at the Precourt Institute for Energy. He's known globally for his work and leadership in developing digital methods such as BIM, or Building Information Management, 4D modeling, which he had to explain to me at lunch, VDC, or virtual design and construction, to increase the productivity of construction project teams, enhance building performance, and create new strategic opportunities for firms in the construction industry. His award-winning research results have been used by many industrial and governmental organizations around the world. He's co-authored the book Integrating Project Delivery, published by Wiley in 2017. Martin, are copies available for purchase in the lobby? He's written over 100 journal articles and book chapters, and has given over 100 keynote lectures in his research. He's been the principal thesis advisor for 31 PhD students, one of whom I believe is in the room today, and has lived, worked, consulted, and taught in Europe, South America, North America, Middle East, Asia, and Africa. He's fluent in German, English, French, and Spanish, but probably in that order, right? Our last presenter is Brian Wenter from Miller Starr, where Tori also works. He's a shareholder there in the Walnut Creek office and a member of the firm's land use department. His practice centers on land use and governmental law, with a particular focus on obtaining and defending land use entitlements for a wide range of development projects. I can tell you that in the work I do, there's more defending than obtaining. He represents he provides strategic advice to developers, home builders, landowners, and public agencies in all aspects of land use in California CEQA compliance. He previously served as city attorney and assistant city attorney for Walnut Creek. He received his Juris Doctor and Master of Regional Planning, that's an interesting combination, from North Carolina Chapel Hill, and his BA from Oregon. He's a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. So thank you all for participating, and now we're going to jump into the full presentation. Eric, in a moment, will have your slides up. I really wanted to start with you because I understand least what you do. I know it's a bit of a secret, and maybe that's intentional.
Yeah.
Can you turn my mic down just a little bit? Thank you. Tell us a little bit about what you do, at least what you can tell us, and then kind of describe, if, at a 40,000-foot level, how you folks are solving the big picture issues that you perceive in the housing world. And
Sure.
And then if you can, I know there's maybe not as much Bay Area, but
Yeah.
I guess tell us what you can.
Yeah, I think I want to start by just underscoring how much of affordability, which is the topic of this forum today, is around policy and lawmaking and people that are representing the social interest. Technology definitely plays a role in it and can be a tool in the solution of this, but I've really been reticent to look at technology as a solution to affordability. A lot of it has to do with land use planning and zoning and density permits and reducing parking requirements and encouraging more widespread adoption of ADUs. I think getting more supply into the system is very much more of a political challenge than a technological one. I just want to start with the outset, making that clear. I think the technology innovation can be contributing and enabling in some respects, but is by no means the solution. I don't want anyone to take away that perspective. Sorry, that was just
That's okay. No,
opening with a disclaimer. Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs is an urban innovation fund that was set up by Alphabet a couple of years ago. I was actually was lucky enough to be on this kind of think tank group at Google way back in the day in 2014, I guess, when we were working with Larry Page on talking about how this could be an interesting thing to pursue. And Larry is a longtime urban utopian kind of guy, and he's always ambitious about urban technologies. I think self-driving cars is a great example of Larry's excitement for the built realm and cities and mobility. And so I was on a team that encouraged the board to get the money together to start this thing called Sidewalk. And right from the beginning, our goal has been to lead by example for what urbanism could be, and if we were to design a district from the ground up, kind of outside of the encumbrances and all the legacy systems that cities are typically managing today, what would we do differently if we were to think, in the age of digital technology and from the internet up, if we were to design a city from scratch, how would we go about and do that? And so that's really been the ambition of Sidewalk Labs from the onset, and that's what we're actually pursuing today in Toronto. There's a large-scale development on the waterfront of Toronto that we are actively engaged in design and development of.
So as you, as you go throughout your day, and there's a not fairly decent-sized team of people in your organization.
Yeah.
Is there? I'm curious. Is there kind of top-down management? How do you? I mean, does someone create kind of the big picture? This is our goal. How do you go about solving the problems? And I know affordability and creating a great number of housing units is certainly one of those, as I understand.
Absolutely, it's a huge part of it. I think our goals, we're led by a gentleman named Dan Doctoroff, who used to be the deputy mayor of urban development for the Urban Economic Development Corporation of New York City. He was also the CEO of Bloomberg. And he had a leading role in the rebuilding of New York City post 9/11 and more recently with the Hudson Yards development on the west side. So he has a deeply ingrained understanding of urbanism and development and all the forces that are at play in large-scale projects like this. So he is obviously leading the effort, but we have a lot of high-level experience across sustainability and affordability technology that are all coming together to make this thing happen.
Okay, very interesting. So how much can you tell us, I guess, about, as an example, and maybe let's flip to...
Sure.
Oh, I realize I can flip the slides. That's the whole idea here. Oh, I did want to explain.
Oh, yeah.
You can see kind of where Sidewalk Labs fits in. It's not Google. It's one of the several companies under the Alphabet umbrella.
We're calling them other bets right now.
Other bets.
Yeah.
Good.
So there's the Alphabet, and we're one of the other bets.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right. So really, the overriding question is, can technology improve the experience of urban living? And obviously, you're saying yes, it can.
We're optimistic about it. I think you look at the role that technology's played in our understanding of the city and the way we navigate the city and the way we experience the city. It's been actually quite profound. You can look at what the steam engine did for the way cities were laid out and the way proximity was assigned. You look at the electrical grid and how that transformed the way we interact with city electric light, and all of a sudden now evening and late hour activities became possible, and obviously the automobile and with this kind of and a lot of the sprawl, unfortunately, that resulted from that also had just absolutely huge implications for the way cities were navigated and understood.
So one of the things, I'm glad you got to that, because one of the things I'm wondering about, and you're doing two things that intersect, which is you've got Waymo, which is going to change the way people think about and use automobiles.
Yes.
Do you think that change, self-driving cars and the fact that people are buying, well, not this year, they bought a lot of cars, but eventually people will probably buy fewer cars and rely on people to drive them, or cars without people to drive them.
Or robots to drive them, mobility services.
Do you think that does that change the equation for how Sidewalk Labs looks at new projects?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the motivators for us endeavoring to this project in Toronto, was thinking about if we were to design a city with this type of technology in mind, with self-driving cars sort of at the core of it, how would that affect our understanding of urbanism? Like, how does that affect street width? How does that affect intermodal transit, like from train stations to the last mile problem, getting people to their homes and places of work? So it is exactly a test bed or a demonstration opportunity for us to showcase the capabilities of this new age.
So I want to ask the other panelists, any thoughts on automobiles, that technology, or how that's changing, and whether it affects your business and the way you're attacking the problem?
Yeah, for us, it definitely does. We're trying to build as little parking as possible in any project we do, just anticipation of fewer cars being parked at any time, but particularly at night. Any parking that we do build, we're trying to do it above ground, have it be flat deck, and anticipate that at some point we'll have to convert that parking into office or residential or some other use, and look forward to that. My fear is that self-driving cars have the potential to exacerbate the original sin of the automobile and make sprawl easier to happen. So I'm sure you guys have thought about that a lot, and I hope that self-driving cars aren't an enabling technology for sprawl, but I'm also looking forward to having a robot drive me around, since I don't like driving that much.
Can I jump in on that real quick too? Like, I think the notion of parking going to zero is not necessarily a foregone conclusion. I think there's still a lot of like modeling and simulation that suggests that we still may require parking even for self-driving vehicles to be stored, so you don't have these long periods of latency for service. So there may need to be repositories around the city, and parking lots may still exist. And so I think that's also something to keep in mind, that a lot of this stuff, the way it's used is still really up in the air. And I think self-driving cars in itself will not be the solution. I think there's still lots of other alternatives that need to be explored and pushed further, like transit-oriented development and better metro links and better existing public transit services also need to be amplified, reducing total vehicle miles traveled, regardless of whether they're legacy vehicles operated by humans or whether they're operated by robots. I think moving away from ridership and automobiles is still a strong thing to do, an important thing to do for better urbanism. Agreed. I don't want to be Mr. Caveat disclaimer, but I think it's important to make our position clear.
So, I mean, I'm curious what you guys have heard. Just actually a couple of weeks ago, some of my researchers have said, yeah, you know, it's really 20 years out before we have truly level 5 autonomous vehicles. And in the meantime, there's a lot of the researchers are working on the interaction between a human and a car. And then I think the broader theme of mobility for all kinds of things, you know, goods and people, I think is indeed very fascinating. I'm wondering if you guys, it sounds like you guys are having some research maybe through models to understand different scenarios of that, because I have kind of the same fear as you. It seems like we could just, with drones and with self-driving cars and all kinds of deliveries, we could just, we could really decide to live wherever we would like, right?
And there's this risk of the zombie car problem, where you, instead of having one occupant vehicles, you have 0 occupant vehicles. You know, it's actually going to even increase traffic and congestion. So it has the exact opposite effect.
Yeah, I think if packages are being delivered by empty vehicles, if drones are not widely accepted, which there is obviously some resistance to drones and the noise and whatnot, traffic theoretically should get a lot better, but I don't think anyone knows.
I agree. I think these are all real things to solve, and why I need to underscore that, like, still public transit and public mobility is still going to play a very, very, very important role in the future, and that we can't rely on self-driving technology to be the panacea that solves everything.
From a construction perspective, I think supply chain management should get a lot better in terms of the ability to get the right materials to the projects at the right time. Which for construction is still, I mean, from the whole society perspective, you might say maybe not that super critical, but I think from a construction perspective, there's still lots of inefficiencies because of that, and therefore cost and schedule increases.
Yeah.
All right, so I don't know if you want to comment on that slide, or?
I think it's quite self-explanatory. You know, we're really focused on people, I want to say. You know, like the city is one thing, and I think arbiter, like the buildings are an arbiter for business and living and growth and education, but it's really the people that are the most important part of it. If you don't have people, you don't have a city. So you can make a really impressive shell with all the bells and whistles, but if no one wants to be there, you've failed.
I agree. I think one of the most interesting things that you're looking at, which is, there's been quite a bit of research in, is wood structures. Yeah. People think of wood structures typically as single-family homes, possibly 5 to 6-story loft buildings, but beyond that, there's very little understanding of how possible it might be to build high-rises out of wood.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting research that's been going on in Europe for maybe almost 2 decades now that points to a much greater potential for timber structures in terms of high-density construction. We think higher buildings are possible with it, and there's been some great demonstration projects in Canada and in Europe that showcase that. I think there's 18 stories have been the tallest one that's been delivered now using a timber core, and there's up to 36 stories in the plans. And so the benefit of timber is, obviously from a carbon standpoint, it acts as a carbon sink as opposed to a carbon source. You're taking all the carbon or CO2 in the atmosphere from the trees that they capture in their wood fiber and using that as construction material as opposed to the concrete or steel, which actually has a lot of CO2
Absolutely.
emissions associated with their production.
Yeah.
They're also much lighter buildings in terms of actual mass, and so if you have a lighter construction, you also have an opportunity for less significant foundations depending on the soil type. So you could actually require less excavation and less concrete to support those foundations. So from a carbon standpoint, we think there's a huge opportunity here, but we're just getting to the details, and that's always where the devil is. Also from a cost perspective, just looking at the natural resources of North America, particularly in Toronto, we're focused on this, where there's a great boreal forest and a very developed softwood lumber industry. We have hope that mass timber products, not necessarily just CLTs, but mass timber products could play a really important role in making the economics of these developments pencil out a bit better. Prefab elements, do you want me to jump into this?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think it's about offsite construction.
Randy's going to
This is really Randy's thing, yeah,
But that's
exactly.
okay. I mean, I think you can cover the general topic a little bit.
Yeah, so I think you've seen cost of labor going up in cities pretty steadily for decades now. Some of it has to do with like trades and labor organizations and things like this, but it's a significant cost component. Ask anyone who's been doing developments in Palo Alto for $1,000 a foot. A lot of that comes from on-site trade and labor. And so is there opportunity for making safer, more productive environments for these workers to produce these like highly repetitive products? So things like bathroom cores or kitchens or lift cores. Is there a way for these prefabricated elements? Even MEP type systems can be done off-site, much more analogous to the automotive industry where you have like wiring harnesses, for instance, that are mass produced that then serve a vehicle production line. Kind of using that same logic to make construction a bit more efficient.
Yeah, and I'll say that there are a number of different approaches, everything from panelized construction, which is just a little wall section, a 10 by 10 section of this wall, to companies that are building structures almost as large as this room and floating them, down a river on a barge and then craning them into place. There's kind of the sky's the limit, depending on, the location, the economics, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Digital workflows. Again, this is probably more in Martin's wheelhouse,
Exactly.
but the notion of taking a design or a conceptual model and using that unified model to take you all the way to production is one that's kind of novel for construction. There's a lot of players and a lot of middlemen typically in the process, and there's a lot of information transfer and a lot of like drawing and redrawing of parts or components or details or assemblies. And what we're trying to do is like really unify that model to just simplify the entire process and make sure that knowledge is being transferred in the most effective way possible. But it's also really useful for things like 4D, 5D, 6D modeling when you can start doing kinematics and logistics and understanding cost to a very high degree of detail and specificity. If you can like load the trucks with the materials in the order that they need to come off the truck when they get to the construction site, so the crane pick takes it off the truck and puts it directly to where it needs to go. All that coordination just wasn't really capable without the digital technologies that are emerging today, and so we think it's a huge opportunity.
I would cover more, but I think between
Martin's
Randy and
probably
Martin, we're
gonna
probably
dive.
going to take
Absolutely.
a deep dive into
Absolutely.
this. But I'm glad
They're the experts.
I'm glad you guys are also focused on it.
Yeah. Micro living. So this is really just driving a density and how the benefits of the city are great, and we want to extend those benefits to as many folks as possible. But land is scarce in cities, and so having that proximity requires slightly compressed living spaces potentially. And we pointed to earlier, like the divergence between earnings and the cost of housing is a scary one. And so to make independent units more affordable to more people, we're looking at kind of shrinking the footprint and how we can make better utilization of these smaller spaces. And so one example is this company called Ori Systems that's a media lab spin out that has this kind of like robotic wall that has like your bed and your closet and everything folded into it and kind of move back and forth in a space to allow a more multitude of uses.
Is that actually up and running where people could, doing micro units could call them and say, hey, would you do my FF&E? Would you come in and equip my units with these,
Yeah, for sure.
these-
The Ori's is up and running.
cool.
We have one we're experimenting with right now.
Nice.
Yeah.
So people have probably heard and maybe even seen micro units. They're getting very popular in San Francisco. One of the difficulties in many places in the country is that is legislation. Ordinances, in some cases, restrict what you can build. The units have to be a certain size, otherwise they're classified as single room occupancy hotels, which have a very negative connotation. That's starting to change. Brian, I don't know if you've seen that locally. I know in Chicago, we have a project that we're working on right now that when we started it about 4 years ago, we were going to do 100 units. And we got that entitled at 100 units in a 14-story building. And as the laws have changed, and they wanted at that time 1-to-1 parking, 100 parking spaces. As things have evolved, because it's next to a train station, every time we go back for a meeting, they say, well, why don't you do more units and have less parking? And we're like, well, we proposed that, but you said no. Well, now we want it. And now it's evolved to 188 units and no parking. That's how much it's changed in Chicago. And I'm sure I know that's true in San Francisco. I don't know about if there are other Bay Area cities where micro units are allowed.
Not micro units per se that I'm aware of, but accessory dwelling units under state law that changed in 2016 that mandated statewide that all cities and counties allow code-compliant accessory dwelling units through a ministerial sort of over-the-counter, non-public hearing, non-CEQA approval process.
Yeah.
And so that has actually produced a major spike in the production and application for accessory dwelling units.
I know that's the case in Palo Alto. Did you see that in Walnut Creek? People taking advantage of it, or not so much?
It's a little less in Walnut Creek, and it's not
Yeah.
the kind of project I'll ultimately get involved in because it doesn't need me. It's very much a applicant-driven process, but much more so in Los Angeles and San Francisco. The numbers are actually quite staggering.
Good to know. Okay.
This shared ownership and alternative developments, I think there's a lot of innovation and creative thinking that could happen in this space. There's lots of precedents globally for alternative means of development. Like, I always point to the Baugruppens in Germany, where there's kind of these building collectives that are just made up of general citizens who take on the task of developing their own multifamily dwelling units. And I think I would love to see and encourage more types of thinking in this space that is a bit outside of the status quo for development.
Yeah, agreed. I think that was your last slide.
It might have
Yeah,
been,
yeah, I think so. So, Gino, if you could key up the second slide deck. That's an interesting thing that you mentioned. I had never seen that, but I saw a travel show. There was a town in Germany where there's a huge collective. People got it zoned, built it, live in it, and they without the government requiring them, there's a low income aspect to it, and people live there. 20% of his people pay $1 a year. And because there's no profit motive, somehow the economics work.
Yeah.
Seems to me that in the US that might be a legal issue. We've probably got some land use attorneys in the crowd, and Ryan, to make that happen, it could be, I think it'd be amazing here. It'd be great in the Bay Area, but I don't know if current zoning laws would allow that. Housing collectives, I mean, sounds like a 70s thing, in
No,
Southern
it's
California.
certainly well within the authority of communities to allow, given the police power in California and sort of the classic home rule that allows cities, in essence, to regulate so long as they're not doing so inconsistently with state or federal law. They can absolutely make the choice to allow it.
Cool. All right, thank you. We're gonna kind of slide to the right, just slightly, to Randy. And Randy, I picked and chose among your slides,
Sure.
so take a look where we ended up. I guess, tell us, if you have any kind of introductory statement, feel free to, if not, I'm gonna jump right into some questions.
Yeah, so our thesis is that while politics and legal considerations are a major consideration in housing affordability, sheer construction costs are also really, really important. And on our projects in Oakland, on many of the projects, even if the land is free, just by sheer construction costs, the project can't pencil, doesn't go forward. So I see us in this situation where if we compare construction to the automotive industry, we're in this world where the only thing that we can build is a 7 Series BMW and an S-Class Mercedes. That's to say that the entire multifamily industry is focused on luxury apartment construction and condo construction, and then there's a subsidized, affordable industry, but nothing at all in the middle. And so that if you can't afford a new 7 Series BMW or S-Class Mercedes, there is no Civic or Camry option for you. You have to go out and buy a 25 or 30-year-old S-Class or 7 Series. That's the situation that we're in construction. Our thesis is that construction needs that 1913 Model T movement, the moving assembly line, to come in and dramatically reduce the cost of construction. And you know, if you look back in history, before 1913, before the moving assembly line, you could buy an automobile, but you had to be rich, and it was a handmade car of poor quality. When the moving assembly line was introduced in the Model T, all of a sudden, everything changed. And the industry exploded, and there was mobility available to the masses. That industrial revolution, that Model T moment, has never happened in construction. That's what we're trying to create.
I like that analogy. It's good. So you feel that vertically integrating the construction process is the answer, and you've kind of set about doing that.
Yeah, I think it's a requirement for now, because what we're doing is difficult. There's a tight iteration loop that's required, and I don't think you can get that tight feedback loop, that tight iteration loop, if we're outsourcing all of our iteration. If we're outsourcing all of our innovation. And the standard situation in construction is you don't want to do anything innovative because it's not worth the risk. And if you do something innovative and it doesn't work out, and you're working with outsourced contractors, engineers, and architects, the minute there is a misstep, you all are going to get a phone call, and everybody sues each other. And that's a really difficult way to make technical progress. So our thesis was, hey, we're going to do something that's hard here. We're probably going to have some missteps. But when we do misstep, we're not going to sue ourselves. We're going to regroup and work through it. And that's been very successful to date. I don't know that this model has to stand forever. But for now, while we're getting from site-built construction to industrialized construction, I think this model is important.
I agree. You know, Martin, I don't know if you want to jump in on this. I remember from helping you teach one of your classes where you talked about integrated project delivery, you know, having everybody inside the circle, so to speak, which is what they're doing, as opposed to, you know, all these disparate relationships where everybody's interests might not be aligned, could be very helpful.
Yeah, it's a little painful. I mean, as an academic, I don't do actually projects, but I have the privilege of working with lots of teams all over the globe. And the story just repeats itself again and again. We sub-optimize our developments everywhere. We start with the lowest first step, and then that constrains the next step, et cetera, et cetera. When, in fact, a building functions as a whole building, with all the disciplines having to work together, all the systems having to work together. So it's really kind of crazy why we draw out the process so long, when today there's really no excuse why you couldn't bring everybody together that you need in the building, design, construction, use, operation process anyway, and have them collaboratively develop a good solution, instead of constraining the structural engineer solution by an architectural solution. And then that solution constrains the mechanical engineer solution, and then the construction solution, et cetera. We have just seen dramatic improvements in functionality of the building, time to market, and ultimately value by bringing people together and supporting them with tools like you showed a glimpse. And it's actually not understandable by a 20-year-old that wants to learn about design and construction and development, why not every project would work this way. If you can explain that, then please come to my class, and you can see how you do. if that makes
try.
sense. Well, I mean, I'm advocating for more integrated way, right? Yeah.
So Randy, I selected a couple of slides so that the audience can understand how this system works. It's obviously a little bit technical, and most people in the room are attorneys. So I think this is a particularly good slide. That's the footprint on the left, the footprint of the building. And then to the right, it's a blow-up of one module, or one possible module that you've identified.
Yeah, this is the genesis of our modular effort. It was a student housing project just a couple blocks from UC Berkeley. And we were laying this project out just for construction efficiency because it was a homogeneous student population. We said, okay, we can make every bedroom the same, we can make every bathroom the same, we can make every kitchen the same. And when we did that, the design just screamed for manufacturing. And so we sought out to find that solution. That was a good starting point. Now, going forward, we don't make every apartment unit the same in every building, but this was a starting point that allowed us to do it. And yeah, so this is how this project turned out. It was a very successful project. It was the genesis of the effort, but we went and did a test project, a very small 5-unit project to make sure that the technology would work, and then we undertook this project here.
Okay.
This entire project was 236 modules, but there were only 2 different types of modules that.
I'm curious, how long after the foundation was complete, how long until all of the until it was essentially, occupiable?
Yeah, once all the site work was done, I think this was about 12 months of vertical construction, thereabouts. And really that was constrained more by our ability to ramp up our production line from 0 than by any particular site constraint.
If you did this today?
If we did this today, I think the vertical construction would be around 6 months.
It's pretty fast.
Yeah, it's fast. It's fast.
This is what the interior of the units look like?
Yeah, and these are student housing units, but this was an awful lot better than what I got to live at UC Berkeley.
Most places.
So talk about how you, and we have some slides that'll follow this, talk about how you translate something where you've got a small crane and a little module into a high-rise.
So the modules vary from 30 to 40 feet in length and from 10 to 14 or even 16 feet wide. So basically right at the maximum width limits for highway transportation. They're shrink wrapped at the factory, just like a prepared meal from Whole Foods, and goes to the job site, and we have either a mobile crane or a tower crane, and we stack them up, make the structural connections and the plumbing and electrical and air conditioning connections, and that's most of the work. The interesting thing about those projects is all 4 of those projects are made from the same catalog of about 20 modules. And you can produce a huge variety of buildings from a catalog of 20 modules, as opposed to the typical situation that we find in construction. We'll get an architect's drawings, and it might be a 100-unit building, and there's 24 different floor plans because there was some motivation to sub-optimize. And so that's what we see. Someone thought, if I have 24 different floor plans, I'll squeeze out an extra 0.5% of rentable area. And what that designer or developer didn't realize is he just drove up construction costs by 15%. So we're trying to avoid that.
Here's a couple of slides that show the different module types, if you will, the catalog. I think it's pretty amazing. Those are nice units to begin with, but the fact that you can double them and, that's...
Yeah, and each of those modules is represented at a particular size, but you can make it longer or shorter or wider, but it's the same basic module. And one of the nice things about it is we know what those modules cost. So if we're looking at a project, or if someone is coming to us for a project, we don't have to spend 18 months and $2 million in design to get a set of drawings that we can take to a contractor, to get a number that we can take to a bank, and then come back to the contractor and pray that he'll hold his price. We know what our costs are because it's all from a simple catalog.
I thought it'd be interesting for people to see what the factory looks like, so I picked a couple of slides. That's kind of disassembled in the factory. This is them. Maybe explain what we're looking at here.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a production line. It's on rails. There's 40 stations. We're able to work simultaneously underneath the module, outside the module, inside the module. One of the challenges we do have is we're still using metal studs and drywall. The same stuff. It's an improvement over lath and plaster, but in a manufacturing environment, it's a terrible material. So one of the next steps is to change the palette of materials that we use to build with. And of course, there's building code constraints to do that, but there's huge motivations to go to a new palette of materials that lend themselves to manufacturing.
I see Eric shaking his head. Are you looking at, nanobots? I mean, are you looking at, what sorts of innovations, carbon fiber?
Yeah,
What's
it's always
out there?
something I agree with. Especially from a production standpoint, the bottleneck of drywalling, if anyone has worked in the trades, understands like how many days you spend taping and sanding and mudding and how that slows the total production line. So I think getting away from drywall is exactly the right thing to do. The reason it's so widespread is for its fireproofing capabilities and for its cost, but I'm optimistic that there's other alternative materials that we could use that could achieve that same standard of safety and fire rating that could be delivered much more quickly, much more efficiently. We're experimenting all over the map. Like I said, we're looking a lot in timber and trying to use timber fiber in the most effective way possible, and a lot of that isn't having solid slabs, but looking at sandwiches and composites that can leverage the structure of that fiber in a more intelligent way. We've been exploring wacky things like mushrooms and mycelium as an insulation material, with some goal of having end of life cycle stories a bit more buttoned up for buildings and the construction and landfill end of things. So we're all over the map. Another one we've been looking at is shikui plaster, which is this Japanese plaster that also has similar fireproofing qualities as gypsum, but it can actually be sprayed on, and so you could just do wet on wet application as opposed to all this cycles of sanding and drying and taping. So I think there's lots of interesting things out there, and it's just a lack of creativity and exploration that's held us to the standards and materials we see today. And so I'm optimistic that we can make major gains in that direction.
Martin, you get around the world regularly. Are you seeing innovations in new types of building materials and even maybe modular in other countries?
In modular, yes. In new materials, maybe not yet, but I think that's why I'm so anxious to sort of get the whole construction world digitized, because the material revolution, I think, is not far behind. From what I see here in labs and what people are talking about, the kinds of things you mentioned, Eric, starting to be used. The 3D printing world is looking actually quite interesting. I was somewhat skeptical a few years back, but we did a case study actually now a few years ago with Hermes Elisa, the premier. Okay, they build 7 series buildings, but S-class buildings. They did the facade on the Apple headquarters, for example. They got very excited about 3D printing facade elements. Because just the many parts and the leaks and the many things you have to handle. And as of 3 years ago, you could print like a 4 by 1.5 meter window frame out of metal, technically entirely possible. The only issue was it was 10x in cost or time. You had to pick because it was slow, so you needed 10 machines, so that drove the price up to 10x or duration 10. So in that sense, not feasible. But on the other hand, we also looked at brackets and attachment brackets, and we could build a stronger bracket, 3D printed, with 11% of the material. Wow. So environmentally, dramatically higher performance. So if we look, and it's difficult to predict whether this will happen, but if you look at the plastic printing, after the patents expired somewhat recently, the cost of the printers dropped by about a factor of 10. And so in the metal printing world, which I think is more interesting for our industry, The patents, some have expired and many will expire soon. So it could actually be upon us sooner than expected, this sort of 3D printed, or not. I mean, there's these, I get a little upset when people say I printed a whole car or we printed a whole building. No, they printed the structure or they printed the hood. So in terms of whole building with multiple materials printed, I think that'll be a ways off. But in terms of being able to create custom components very fast and without leaks in terms of water getting in, air getting out, greater energy efficiency, lower quality problems, that I think is probably within the next decade.
Cool. Here's another shot of the factory, kind of self-explanatory, I'd say. This is interesting. This is, it looks like maybe there's a floor and some walls going up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we found in our initial exploration of modular is the manufacturers that we found, for the most part, were building 6-sided wooden boxes. So a floor, a ceiling, and 4 walls, basically a trailer without the wheels. And the interesting thing about this was when we said, hey, well, you know, what's the cost of this, and can we buy your modules for our student housing projects? And this was before we really got into the quality questions. It turned out there was no cost savings at all, and I didn't really understand that. I said, well, you know, you've got this production environment, and it's obvious to me that if you take a worker, remove him or her from a job site, put a roof over their head with the work in front and the material to the left and the tools on the right, it has to be more efficient. It has to be. So why can't you save me any money? And one of the reasons turned out that when you take 6-sided boxes and you start stacking them up and stacking them next to each other, you end up with 2 of the 6 sides completely redundant. So a redundant wall-wall assembly and a redundant ceiling-floor assembly. And it seemed like, oh, this is just a simple realization. And what was happening was, yes, they had a 30% cost improvement in their unit productivity in the factory, but by the time they got to the job site, they were actually building 30% more building than the conventionally built building next door. And so the price ended up about par.
And it was probably heavier, so the foundation system probably had to be more
dramatically heavier. Now the fact is, Bay Area costs have gone up so much that that method of construction, the 6-sided wood box, actually does have a cost savings. But our thesis was, hey, we're not going to do that. We're going to take out the extra wall. We're going to take out the extra ceiling framing assembly. And we're just going to be clever about our engineering and an engineered temp waterproofing system. We're not going to build 30% extra. We're going to take 30% savings. And you know, it turns out the engineering is tricky. But it's not like trying to launch a Tesla into space, and it's, you know, it's working out.
Cool. All right. I think we covered that. I'm going to rush ahead because we've got to shift speakers a bit. You could just explain this.
Yeah, I mean that's just kind of showing how this works. You can see how the module being landed there forms the enclosure of the module below and the module to the left.
And has no duplicative roof or extra side.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so this is how we're moving into high-rise construction. So all that's happening here is the gravity system, the weight-bearing structure for the tower is contained in the module, which we build at the factory, and then that ties into a core that carries the earthquake and the wind loads in the center of the building. That's what this is showing.
Cool. So I do have one audience question that came in that kind of relates to you. And I'm going to rephrase the question, Jonathan York, thank you. Do you think as this has been catching on for many years? I mean, even 20 years ago, I looked at wood versions of this. And in China, it's quite popular. It's starting to obviously take root here. Do you think the construction model, maybe even the development model, is going to shift more and more in this direction, or do you think it's going to, you know, be a long road?
Yes and yes. I mean, there's the idea of modular construction is not new at all. People have been trying this for the entire post-war era, and it's no secret that there's a lot of dead soldiers on on the side of this road. At the same time, in terms of market penetration, we've seen it go from 0.25% to 0.5% to 1% to now I think modular construction is maybe around 2% of construction, at least in California. And so that's still very small, but it's exponential growth. Alongside that, there is a genuine cost advantage to this method of construction. And as we get better and as others enter the space, that cost advantage will grow. And I anticipate we'll get to a point, hard to say when, but I would say certainly within the next 20 years, where modular construction, where prefabrication becomes the standard means of construction. And just like you can buy a handmade car or a handmade motorcycle, only an enthusiast would do that, and the average daily driver wouldn't even consider a handmade car. And I think we'll get to that point where the average developer wouldn't consider a handmade building.
Good. Thank you, Randy. We're going to shift to Martin. As your slides are coming up, because I think it's a big part of what we're going to talk about, can you explain simply BIM, or Building Information Modeling? What is that?
Yeah, if you look around you, right, we see a lot of stuff, and the building information model is essentially the digital twin, as it's sometimes called, of what you see. And it's, again, difficult to explain to a 20-year-old why you wouldn't create one model, because you're building one building. You're not building 50 buildings, you're building one building. Then why do we insist on having 50 different digital representations, drawings, partial 3D models, etc., of the same thing? This increases the friction in design, development, construction tremendously, leads to many mistakes, and doesn't give you a digital representation of your building when you're done, which we should have, so we can do things with the computer instead of just keep typing things in. I don't know if that's reasonable enough.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's good. I put your...
And so, yeah, this looks a little bit complicated, but I guess until we get to a more productized way of building things, which I see being worked on around the world by companies that enter markets, that they see construction as a place they can disrupt, but also by people in the market. They say, we mostly service company today, but we see some sectors that where we're working, where we could standardize and offer the, the A, B, E, and S model, and clients can choose. And so that's what I'm trying to show here. I guess if you go back just a second, basically, people make projects happen. That's what I'm showing in the middle on the right. But we need to support the people. It's 2018. We need to support them with good digital tools. That's basically what I just explained, the digital twin. At the end of the day, we're delivering a building, a product. So let's have a representation of that in a computer, that the computer can help us do things. And that leads to a different way of having to organize the process. If you can, sorry, just stay on that slide. Which are so to the right, and a different set of objectives we can now reach. And so what I'm suggesting is that we use something like this, bringing people, how we work, how we manage, and the tools that we use together in a, create basically a 2018 version of managing projects, and just do this all the time. So we don't start and reinvent the wheel again and again from project to project. And those of you in project development, you can set the tone from the beginning. Then you have the opportunity of using the information in a visual way for coordination of the systems, make sure everything fits, and you have predictable construction, to showing how, in that case, a supermarket, a shopping center really works from a detail to, maximizing daylight, just showing everybody, yep, we heard your concern, and here is how we have implemented it. To using virtual reality, which is quite affordable now, to really make sure that the users get what they want, get their input when it matters. And this leads to dramatically better control of your destiny. So one of the companies that we've been working with for a long time, okay, they're building more 5 Series, 7 Series types of buildings, is Optima, a vertically integrated developer, operating mostly in Scottsdale and Chicago. What you see here is, I think, the first multi-family, large-scale housing development in Chicago after the financial crash.
That's right.
And basically what they, possibly in the country, I think. And they basically said, since we have gone with the method I showed on the previous slide, we are in full control of our destiny. We do have no more project surprises. We are on the same page with the city council. We get our project through the city council rapidly. Then we are on the same page with all of our engineers and with our builders. We get built what we want. If we want to make a change, sure, we can make a change. But there's no more surprises from anybody else. So we have dramatically better cost and schedule predictability. We have dramatically shorter schedule, which is super important for us to go to time to market. And I think those advantages we can apply not only to these types of buildings, we can apply them to every type of building. Yeah, we can go on.
Obviously, yeah.
So obviously, in a building information model, I guess what the previous slide was showing, is you have information about this beam. And so the computer knows this is beam, and it's this big, and it's this location, etc. This is all information we need for all kinds of tasks. And so you can take that information and use it. It's crazy why anybody would measure something on a drawing today. The computer is quite good at counting. This is one thing it can actually do. So we should use it for that. But the computer is also good at, well, computing. And this is what I'm showing here, the opportunity to optimize a project. This is what we did with, okay, it's a soccer stadium, not affordable housing, but we have to develop these methods on projects where, you know, we get asked to, we get invited to work with the people. So this was the first project we did like this close to 10 years ago with Arab Sports in London. They had designed the roof truss of the soccer stadium in the Middle East, and they were super proud of their design because they had looked at 39 alternatives, which was staggering, right? And they come up with a design for a truss that weighed 2,700 tons. We took exactly the same tools, the building information model of the truss, the digital twin of the truss, the same analysis tools, and connected them digitally. And now the computer can vary the truss depth, it can vary, pick this member size, this member or that size, etc. It can do all of these iterations that the engineers were doing manually. It can just do it automatically. So the computer looked, in this case, at 12,800 options in 3 seconds per option instead of 4 hours per option, and found, to everybody's huge surprise, a steel truss that weighed 400 tons less, over 400 tons less, saving 20% of the steel. 4 million saved in just material cost alone, and of course the carbon footprint and all that goes with it. And again, I think in what I'm sort of encouraging you to think about, where can you use the computer to help you? And then you frees you up to do other things. You know, okay, now we have the optimal truss design. I'm sure there's more important fish to fry on this project from many other perspectives. So focus there. But the challenge we have found is access to the data. The people do not want to share data with each other. So quickly, when I show this example, people always told me, yeah, very nice, Martin, but that's just optimizing material cost. The real cost is, of course, fabrication, erection, and all the other costs. And my answer was immediately, yes, please give us these data, and we will do an optimization. It took us 8 years for a fabricator and erector to trust us enough to give us their fabrication and erection data. And so just to illustrate the potential here, and this is just with this particular data set, of course this could vary, but if you take a very simple frame, you see the one on the left from your side with lots of different colors, that is optimized for weight. So use whatever best fitting section you can use, and so you end up with lots of different connections, right? Lots of unique pieces. The one on the right is optimized for availability of sections and cost of the connections. And you see that the one on the right is 8% heavier, but it's 13% cheaper and 20% faster to get. So that's the point what I tried to make earlier. If you're bringing in these parties sequentially, you will have the frame that's optimized for weight, because that's all the structural engineer can do. It's not the structural engineer's fault. That's all the access to the data he or she has. If you brought in the developer, I mean the constructor, and had them work together, you could get the frame on the right that's 30% cheaper, or maybe something in between. You decide on the project. And that was kind of my point when we have this sequential, bringing people in sequentially, we are missing these opportunities. So that's a kind of a few key points. Modernize the processes of getting your projects done. Think about the continuous digital flow of information, like was already mentioned, and bringing all the key parties together early in the project, because that's when you can truly optimize the project.
Thank you, Martin. That's excellent. Well, we have a lot of lawyers in the room, and we're finally going to get to talk about some of the legal aspects of this problem and some of the good news. Brian, we're going to put up your slides are up. I guess tell us a little bit about, I know we're not going to follow the slides exactly, but tell us a little bit about some of the good news in Sacramento and elsewhere that's helping this issue from a legal standpoint.
And let me start with the bad news first. I mean, we have 20-some statutes on the books in California that deal with some aspect of housing and trying to facilitate the creation of housing, of affordable housing, et cetera. And David's slides earlier, which highlight the scale and complexity of the housing crisis, show that those laws have not been sufficient. They haven't been sufficient for decades, and that traces back at least to the 1970s for a variety of reasons. We've got the housing element law, the density bonus law, accessory dwelling units, no net loss and zoning laws, et cetera. All those laws are great, but they're very complicated, and they are not solving the problem. Last year, the governor signed a package of 15 different bills that address various aspects of the housing problem. And they're a good set of bills, but they also are complicated. Some of them have pieces that will make them less effective than they might otherwise have been, and collectively they too will not be enough. I'm sort of skipping ahead here in light of the timing of our program. The good news, however, in my view, is that the conversation in Sacramento on this has clearly changed. For decades, we've had an imbalanced system where the local governments are, and I'm not knocking local governments, but local governments are largely in control of housing approvals, of housing construction, when, where, how, or if housing gets built in their community. And that patchwork quilt of laws is not working. The system is not functioning properly, and it's imbalanced. Those statutes, incidentally, I think every one of them recognizes that housing is a matter of statewide importance. It's not just a local concern. It's not just how you fund your local police force, which is a local matter, but it's something that affects the state overall, the state economy. So the conversation has changed in Sacramento slowly. They're chipping away at different aspects of local control over zoning, and in ways I think that will ultimately be helpful, but there's sort of a game changer out there right now, and I don't know if anybody has heard of this bill, but Scott Wiener is a Democratic state senator from San Francisco. He sponsored Senate Bill 35 last year, which is probably the most noteworthy of the bills that got approved. And in essence, it's a bill that would make approvals of certain housing projects that have affordable components ministerial, with no public hearing, with no CEQA, as long as they comply with objective planning and zoning standards, height limits, setbacks, et cetera. And that bill is a helpful bill. It will do a lot, but it will probably work mostly in communities that are already highly urbanized and that have expensive labor forces. It requires the payment of prevailing wage, which is not something you find in every community. Interestingly, however, that bill in order to process a project under Senate Bill 35, you have to be doing it in a community that is failing to satisfy at least one of the 4 different categories of housing that community needs, whether it be very low income, moderate, or above moderate. HCD last week, or it was earlier this week, released their list of cities and where they fall on this spectrum. It's a very interesting document, and 97% of California cities are failing to provide the housing needs in their community in at least one category. So in almost every community in the state, Senate Bill 35 has the potential to be used. It probably won't be used in a lot of places, but in places like San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, et cetera, it will be used. So that's one piece of good news. The more interesting piece of good news, given the change in the conversation in Sacramento, in my view, is Senator Wiener has sponsored another bill this year. It's SB 827. It's a transit-rich density bonus bill. And it's a game changer. It's the first bill I've seen in my career that actually goes to the heart of the issue. It doesn't nibble around the edges. It just dives right in, and it actually might make a difference if it can get approved. And in essence, what it would do is it would, within a half a mile or a quarter mile of transit, BART stations, Caltrain, certain bus stops with 15-minute headways between buses, it would strip away minimum parking requirements. It would eliminate density limitations, and it would mandate minimum heights depending on the nature of the street frontage of at least 45 feet up to 85 feet. So it would set a floor, not a ceiling. And it's mid-rise housing. It's not high-rises, it's not skyscrapers, but it's a bill that would potentially create up to 3 million new housing units if utilized to full effect and if it eventually gets adopted. So it's not a perfect bill. It doesn't have streamlining. It doesn't have any CEQA changes that would chip away at the ability of frivolous challenges to projects, but it would go a long way if it's approved.
I apologize that we rushed you a little bit. We're now at 2:30, and I do want to take time for some folks to ask questions. I would ask people, please come on up to the microphones.
I'll bring the microphone around.
Oh, great, even better. And try to keep your question brief so we can get as many folks able to ask questions as possible. Must be some. I see. Okay, good.
This is a question for Mr. Rad. Do you have any problems?
He is a rad guy.
I caught that.
Just the R in rad.
Okay. Can you tell us who your manufacturer was for the Dwight project or any of the projects? That's the first question. And if you had any quality control issues, because I'm building a modular project and I've had some significant quality control issues.
Yeah, so we are our own manufacturer for all of these projects. So the pictures you saw of the factory is our production facility in Lathrop, and yes, we've had quality issues, and you know it's hard starting a manufacturing operation from nothing and ramping it up, and so I think it's all about execution and quality control, and I think we've come a long way, and the promise is that ultimately we're manufacturing buildings with Toyota level quality. Most manufacturers are a long way away from that, and we don't achieve Toyota level quality either, but we're getting better and better every year. We just started taking on third-party work in the last year.
Cool. See, there's a question back there.
I have two questions, one to the attorney and one to Mr. Rad. To the attorney, I just got through a process, a 5-year process, including updating general plan, EIR, and everything. The planners, in their infinite wisdom, even though the intent was to increase zoning, increased the floor area ratio at the end of the day. It was planned to go to 5.5, 5.6 floor area. That's how the plan started. But they put in the plan that it would go to 2.5, from 2 to 2.5. And then if you wanted to go above 2.5, you had to do a development agreement. A development agreement is a judicial act by a city council. So the Permit Streamlining Act doesn't protect you. How does it work with this legislation that's come down? It's because it's still there. So if they have if a community wants to block the state, all they have to do is create zoning that requires a development agreement to gain the ultimate zoning or height that would be permitted or the uses that would be permitted. So how does this deal with that if it does?
The bill doesn't deal with development agreements at all, and I'm not sure if my microphone is on.
I just want to ask.
Fundamentally, however, that raises an open legal question that I think most people would suggest that the city, what the city is doing is not proper. A development agreement is a contract. It's an arm's length negotiated agreement that both sides freely enter into. And I think most folks that practice in this area would think that a city can't strong arm somebody into doing a development agreement. It doesn't mean they have to approve perhaps the discretionary land use approvals that a project may need to go, but it does not mean that they can necessarily coerce you into entering into a development agreement that you're not interested in pursuing.
With regard to Mr. Rad, the one thing I couldn't read on your projects, what is the height? In other words, it appears that most of these are steel construction. Okay, do you still have the vacancies or the spaces that normal steel construction has, or is it, a 10-foot ceiling, an 11-foot ceiling? What are the heights?
Sure. So we're working on projects that are 30 to 35 stories now. And our typical module height is 10 feet, and we get about a 9-foot ceiling in that.
Randy, what's your experience been with building departments? Faster, slower?
We're part of this state factory-built housing program, which is administered by HCD, and we thought this would be this great thing. And on our first project, which was fortunately just a little 5-unit pilot project, we got our state plan check and our stamp drawings, and we marched down to the building department at the city of Oakland, and we said, yeah, here we are, we'll take our permit, thank you very much. And they said, no, you won't. And it took another year to get that building permit. We had the wrong approach, and we've learned a lot since then. And so since then, we go in and we find that a lot of cities are not at all familiar with off-site construction, factory-built housing, or the HCD program. And we go in, we make an attempt to educate them, to meet with the building official, the fire marshal, invite them to the factory at their overtime rate and our expense. And so since then, it's been relatively smooth. And so I would say it hasn't been the panacea where we thought, oh, it'll be great, the state's just going to overrule everybody. But it's been fine. And actually, we do get a significant discount in plan check and permit costs because the state plan check and inspection program tends to be a fraction of the cost of typical city fees. But we're not really saving time we're saving maybe a little bit of time at this point. But yeah, not terrible, but not this amazing thing either.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists. It's very fascinating. We're going to take a very quick break and then come back for our keynote speaker, Professor Wara. To introduce this panel is Bob Miller from Lubin Olson.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. My name is Bob Miller. I'm a partner at Lubin Olson, a business law firm in San Francisco. Been involved in the SPIRE presentations here for a number of years, and I'm happy to see it continues to get better and better every year. I want to thank Christine and the organizers for doing such a great job in organizing this. So it's terrific what you've done. Also, I want to ask you, please, I left, my marketing person gave me these bottle openers. Please take them home so I don't have to. There's about 100 of them out there, so please take your bottle opener. Michael Wara is a research scholar at Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. He's also got a JD from Stanford Law School. I had a nice conversation with Michael before the panel, and something that struck me is the old saw about everybody talks about the climate, but no one ever does anything about it. Michael's actually doing something about climate issues and climate policy, and he's going to share some of that work with us this afternoon. He's an expert on carbon emissions, carbon pricing, energy innovation, and energy regulation. And what's particularly interesting about Michael's work is that he doesn't just reside in the ivory tower and write academic papers, which I looked online, and there are a number of very interesting articles there that you can look at. But he also works as a bridge between the ivory tower and the policymakers who are actually implementing the change that we so desperately need in climate policy and energy policy here today. He works with legislators across the country, particularly in California, but also across the country, to take the policy and the legal research and the policy research that he's doing and help them implement better solutions for all of us. He does that in a nonpartisan way, working across party lines to achieve better solutions in the interface between climate change, regulation, and legal policy. Today he'll be talking about that work, and in particular about how climate change is affecting the forests and the interface between climate change, the effect on forests, and the regulated utility networks that we have here in California. So also, Michael, I think as Christine said, Michael would like to get questions throughout the presentation. So if you have questions, we have microphones in the hall. I think so here you go. Without any further introduction, here's our speaker.
Hi, thanks very much. So as has been mentioned twice, I'd love it if, as I'm talking, if you have questions, if you just raise your hand. I'd love to take questions as we talk. There'll also be time for questions at the end if you prefer to wait until then. But I teach, so that's how we roll in class, and I think it's more interesting for the audience as well. So today I'm going to talk about climate policy in California, and initially focus my remarks on mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and what the state has been up to with respect to law and policy on that question. And then I'm going to shift gears and talk about what I think of, what many people in the state are thinking of as a newly pressing climate adaptation issue, wildfire risk. And then talk about the interaction. It turns out, because of quirks in California real property law, that there is actually a pretty strong interaction between some of the increasing risks due to climate change and due to wildfires in particular, and our ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions along the strategies that have been proposed by the state and are kind of considered the most likely to be successful. So, so I'm going to tell you about the plan the state's recently come up with for cutting greenhouse gas emissions to 2030, and also, I'm going to move out of this, and sneak around there. I'll talk about the plan for cutting emissions, wildfires, and what the impacts in particular on investor-owned utilities have been from this season's wildfires, and why that might matter or not, why California is special when it comes to investor-owned utilities and wildfires. And I'll speak more generally about how this might touch on planning and insurance issues as well. And then, what are the implications of wildfires for achieving the greenhouse gas targets, right? How do we connect this question about mitigation and what we need to do to change the energy system in California to make it a lower greenhouse gas emitting system, to how does that connect with the risks that we see emerging? Prior to this year, I think many people were very focused on sea level rise as a risk in California, and that has really shifted because of what happened this fall and winter. So greenhouse gas emissions in the state. This is a figure that just ARB puts out periodically that reflects the state inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. So the total greenhouse gas emissions emitted in the years in the figure, 2000 to 2015. And just to illustrate progress or lack thereof that the state is making on climate. And the peak emissions were sort of back pre-recession, 2005, or I think, yeah, 2005 and 2007 or 8 were kind of peak years in emissions. On the one hand, you can look at this figure and say, well, emissions are lower than they were during those peak years, right? California climate policy success. Of course, if you know the economic history of the United States or the world through the last decade, which I'm sure all of you do, we know that something pretty significant happened right there. And the recession caused a massive drop in emissions in California and nationally and globally. It was a good year for climate. Of course, it's not the kind of success that you want to have in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right? It caused tremendous suffering. And so the real question is what's the trend after the recession as the economy has recovered? And you can see that sort of the continued effect of the recession here. There's a major decline and then minor reductions thereafter, and then a bit of a bump, and then a sort of gradual decline thereafter. And this, I'll just tell you that the preliminary data that's coming out of ARB for last year, this is kind of the official final inventory that they put out. There's a significant lag. But the 2016 data and 2017 data suggest that this trend continues and maybe accelerated a little bit last year because we had more hydropower available finally, right? Another major impact that's affecting this data is the multi-year drought that occurred during the kind of spin-up of many of the climate policies I'm going to talk about in a second. But the basic answer, one way to look at this figure is to say the recession had a big impact, right? Emissions fell, but they have not grown since then, even as the economy in California has recovered quite substantially from the recession. So one thing you might say about climate policy in California is it's kept emissions from rising as the economy has grown. We're not back on the pre-recession trajectory in California or in the United States, but the economy's grown quite substantially, and emissions have continued to fall, albeit at a modest rate. I'll just say what has fallen, what has caused that reduction? Electric power. Changes in the electric power system have driven the reductions. Changes in the mix of electric power that we import into the state are the largest source of reductions, right? So we used to import a lot of electric power generated by coal-fired power plants. I tell my environmental law students, we don't build coal in California, we build it in Nevada and on the res, right? That's where California has its coal-fired power plants. Not so much anymore. We've gotten off those coal plants. We've substituted those plants for those plants with a mix of natural gas and renewables over the last decade. And that has dramatically reduced the emissions associated with imported electric power. At the same time, the electric power in the state, the composition of the electric power in the state has gone through some pretty dramatic shifts. Emissions went up quite a bit in 2011 in the electric power sector when the San Onofre nuclear generating station retired unexpectedly. That was a major hit to climate policy in California, just as Diablo Canyon's retirement in the mid-2020s will also be a challenge. Initially, that retirement, the electric power that was carbon-free was replaced with natural gas-fired power, but over the last few years, that's been backed out, and now mostly renewables are replacing that in-state source of low-carbon power. But all in all, the electric power system is delivering the reductions, right? The electric power system is compensating to some degree for the growth in emissions in other sectors, especially transportation. So that's kind of the picture of where we've been. Where are we going? We're going, at least according to the Air Resources Board and the legislature, in a very ambitious direction. So this is that same data, right? The solid line shows, I hate these laser pointers. I use a bamboo stick when I teach in class. I'm kind of old-fashioned. The solid line is the reported data to 2015. That's the 2020 target. That's the AB32 target. And you can see we're roughly on track. The more recent data, because of the high hydro availability last year, suggests that we've already met the 2020 target ahead of schedule. But the trajectory, you might notice there's a change in slope after 2020, right? And to 2030, the state is planning for a really different kind of system. Much more dramatic annual reductions, much more dramatic changes. And this is coming in a context where, as I told you, we've already squeezed the coal out, right? We've done some of the easy things in the set of opportunities to reduce emissions. And so harder choices probably lie ahead. The legislature adopted kind of an interesting strategy with respect to implementing this target. Thank you. Oh, thanks very much. Oh, I love that. They passed a law called SB 32. It was sort of Senator Pavley's kind of swan song, as she was termed out, that made that point in time, 258 million tons in 2030, a legally binding target, 40% of 1990 emissions. Now, what does legally binding mean? It's what a court will make you do, right? That's what I like to teach. I'm sort of a legal realist when it comes to these things. Not clear what this means, but it's at least the planning target for the legislature and for the Resources Board, which of course is a very powerful agency when it comes to these things. Much less clear, other than that target, are the means available to achieve it. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but let me just talk about the challenge of that target a little bit more, just to put some meat on these bones. So here's that same figure of the reported emissions inventory. The red line is the 2020 target, the AB 32 target. The lower red line is the SB 32 target. That is the 2030 target enacted into law in 2016 at the end of the session. And you can see there's a lot of space there, and the reduction, the magnitude of change is much larger than anything we've done in the state so far, and frankly, than anything anyone has done anywhere on the planet. Right? This is some seriously ambitious climate policy. Complicating it is the fact that the difference between the 2020 target and the 2030 target is, 160 million tons. We've got, according to the 2015 inventory data, we can get about halfway there if we drove electric power sector emissions to 0, which is an ambitious goal in and of itself. Unlikely to be achieved, but we could go a ways in that direction. Left over, right, after you squeeze what can be squeezed out of the power sector, the other things that are left are quite challenging. And we actually don't have much success reducing emissions in the other sectors, especially in transportation, which has become by far, because of the success in the power sector, has become by far the largest source of California greenhouse gas emissions, and also in heavy industry. Most industrial emissions in California are associated with refineries, so they're kind of part of the transportation sector, right? Refineries and the hydrogen plants that are associated with them are the major sources of industrial emissions, as well as the oil production in the state. So transportation. Transportation emissions, I think, are the key challenge. Year-on-year growth since 2014 is about 5% per year in transportation emissions. We are burning more gasoline than we used to. And that's largely, 2014 is an important date. 2014 is the year, mid-2014, is when oil prices crashed from, call it $100 a barrel to $50 a barrel, approximately. I mean, they've been lower than that. Currently, they're a little bit higher than that. Oil's at about 60, Brent is about 65 today, I think, down from 70, but they're far below their highs, and there was a clear response, not just in California, but across the country, to the consequent reduction in gasoline prices. People drove more, VMT is up, and people are substituting cars for smaller SUVs, which are classified differently under the CAFE standards and so have lower gasoline, lower miles per gallon. That experience, that change in price, the rapid change in price, also gives us some evidence about kind of what the response might be in the other direction, at least in the short to medium term, right? And it strongly suggests that the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector is quite high. We sort of already knew that, right? I mean, people respond a little bit when gasoline prices fluctuate, but they don't respond by throwing away their car and getting on the bus, or by moving into high-density housing, right? Some people do. At the margin, there are these effects, but they're not large in the sense of, say, cutting our transportation emissions in California by 40 to 50% over a decade, right? That's the kind of magnitude of change that we're talking about here. And of course, that partly has to do with technology availability, right? Choices, options for people, ability to switch modes, ability to buy an electric vehicle that will actually get them to work and home again, and maybe do some other things before it has to be recharged, for example, and doesn't cost $100,000 like my kids want me to get that thing with the gull-wing doors, but they've seen it in carpool. Affordable alternatives is a key challenge and a key way that there might be opportunities, greater opportunities for change over the next decade than there have been, but that isn't here yet. At the same time, the state faces some pretty important challenges with respect to our policies targeted at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Probably number one is the fact that the Trump administration on April 1st is very likely to begin the process of rolling back the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards that are currently in force and would apply out to 2025 and would force pretty dramatic improvements in the fuel economy of vehicles in the US fleet. That is the very beginning of a process to take authority away from California to do what it plans to do with respect to fuel economy in the California fleet. Under Title II of the Clean Air Act, California, because of its early role in controlling air pollution from vehicles, right? We sort of actually, I think it was yesterday, was the 50th anniversary of the Air Resources Board. I had Emily Wimberger, who is the chief economist at ARB, in my class yesterday, guest lecturing, and she had to hurry back to Sacramento to have cake. The ARB, 50 years ago yesterday, began the process of regulating air pollution from cars. The federal government followed later, and in a kind of complicated preemption compromise, gave ARB continued authority to set stricter standards with respect to new vehicles. Preempted everyone else. Everyone else can opt in under Section 177 of the Act. They have the opportunity to kind of be as good as California if they want to, and many states do, especially in the Northeast. California has taken that authority and run with it with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular has made the claim that if there's an air pollution problem of any sort, California has authority to regulate all types of pollution that come out of the tailpipe of a vehicle, including carbon dioxide. The Bush administration, the second Bush administration, disagreed. That's the reason they disapproved the initial request on the part of California to regulate CO2 from tailpipes. Obama reversed that interpretation of the act and said, no, if there's a serious air pollution problem, California has authority to regulate all types of pollutants. It doesn't take very much imagination to think that we'll be seeing a rulemaking from EPA going back to the Bush administration's interpretation of the act. And that's going to be tied up, see all the case law around judicial deference to changes in regulatory policy. It's going to be a mess, but that's coming. And the significance to the policy goals in 2030 is not so much whether California wins or loses those lawsuits. I actually think they might win. Some of my best students work for ARB these days, and they're smarter than me, so I'm optimistic. The significance is that it will prevent California from being able to apply and get approval for a new waiver for the period from 2025 to 2030. Right? It's going to lock things up in litigation gridlock for at least the first Trump administration and maybe the second Trump administration if there is one. And that will mean that California has to use other means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from cars. That's tricky. One of the main other policies that we've had, which probably many of you are familiar with, is SB 375, which was a law enacted by Steinberg, I believe, when he was in the legislature about a decade ago, and forced regional planning agencies to develop sustainable community strategies. There was a very interesting hearing at the Air Resources Board in December where the ARB staff basically said to the board, this hasn't worked. Even in places where we think the strategies were good, they haven't worked. And we need to really rethink what we're doing on this policy. And that's not something you usually hear ARB say. So it made me sit up and take notice. But I think it just goes to the problem, really the problem probably that was discussed. I only caught the end of the last panel, but the problem of the interaction between land use and greenhouse gas emissions is a very difficult one. It's difficult politically, it's difficult legally, and it's not something where the state can pivot on a dime, right, and drive dramatic reductions in transportation. So this is a key challenge, and resolving this is very much an open question. How transportation is going to be approached under the 2030 strategy is a very much an open question. Industrial emissions are another one. I won't talk too much about it, just to say that nothing the state has done has really impacted emissions from industry to date. So what are we doing? I mentioned that in 2016, the state set a target. In 2017, the legislature spent the bulk of the summer arguing over cap and trade and whether to extend the market-based approach that the Schwarzenegger administration really pushed for and got enacted into law, to extend that to 2030. And before I get into that, I should say, what's cap and trade? If you haven't heard about it, it's a system where the state has placed an overall limit on greenhouse gas emissions for all covered sources. The limit is divided up into permits that are distributed in various ways, and emitters have to submit permits at the end of the year to cover their emissions, right? So if you emit 10 tons, you have to submit 10 allowances to the Air Resources Board. There's trading that's allowed between emitters, and that ensures that the system maximizes the cost effectiveness of the program, right? The least cost abatement will reduce its emissions and sell its extra allowances to the market, and people who create greater value by emitting greenhouse gas emissions will buy those allowances and use them. That's the idea. And it ensures that greenhouse gas targets are met even if all these other, and I haven't talked about them, but I'll just say, and I'm sure many of you know, there are many other policies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions that the legislature and the Air Resources Board have implemented over the last decade. It's kind of a plethora, a portfolio. In Chair Nichols' words, the cap and trade ensures that no ton is left behind, right? I think that's sort of a nice turn of phrase. So the problem was that the cap and trade that was put into law in AB 32 by then Assemblywoman Pavley and the legislature and Governor Schwarzenegger really only gave the ARB authority to use this tool through 2020. So come 2021, there was no authority. AB 398 was the effort in the 2017 session to extend, and probably the most important thing it did was to clearly give legal authority to the Air Board to extend the program, right? The program is a tax. It's especially a tax after Prop 23, right? That narrowed the exception for regulatory fees that had existed under California law and expanded what counts as a tax. And so Prop 26. So cap and trade was clearly problematic under Prop 26, needed new legal authorization, and needed it by a 2/3 majority, which is, it's one thing to get a majority in the democratically controlled California legislature. Even on cap and trade, that can be tough because of mod Dems. But 2/3 was like uncharted territory, particularly for a climate policy. Getting AB 398 passed required Republican votes. One of probably the most fun I had working with the legislature on this bill was going and briefing the Republican staffers who were not used to being consulted about what they wanted out of climate legislation. They're used to saying, no, I am voting no. And the Republican members recognized that they could be key swing votes, and they wanted to get something for it. But they weren't even sure what to ask for because they'd never bothered to really get into the details of cap and trade. So it was sort of a fun, hopefully productive bipartisan moment. AB 398 emerged from it, and it did a few things. It clarified this legal authority question. It set a maximum price that the allowances could go to before ARB would essentially loosen the cap, right? So you could think about this as the price at which a cap and trade turns into a carbon tax, essentially. That's essentially what's going on. It's an alternative compliance payment, right? And that was a key ask of the oil industry in particular, which is very worried about this program. But I think it's also responsible policymaking, right? We're not willing to spend anything on climate in California. We're willing to spend a lot more money than most people, but not absolutely anything. And so that sort of puts that down, but it left the level, that absolute price level, to be determined by the Air Resources Board. And that's something that the ARB is going to be working on this year, and is really kind of a critical decision that has to get made, and expect a giant fight about it. It did a bunch of other things. Probably the most significant also was to prevent one of the key Republican asks was to prevent other limits on some of the sectors that ARB was considering targeting with additional regulation. So the market-based policy is going to be it when it comes to the refinery sector for greenhouse gas emissions. So whatever the cap and trade produces, that's what will be delivered. It also did a bunch of other things with the money. Cap and trade, because the permits to emit are auctioned, generates, last year it generated $2.2 billion. And that is put into a special fund, so it's not part of the big pot, and is spent on a variety of things. Because this was a two-third bill, that money could be allocated in a more flexible way. And key asks from the Republicans who voted for the bill were to, somewhat ironically, cut the forest wildfire fee that residents in unincorporated parts of counties pay to CAL FIRE to help fund forest fire protection, because that was thought to be an illegal tax. That's the rationale. And then also extended some manufacturing tax credits. So the other thing that happened, the other big piece of the discussion was environmental justice. And the bill that passed as a companion bill, conjoined, as they say, with AB 398, was AB 617, which basically puts in place a new framework for managing air pollution, especially toxic air pollution, in so-called fence line or EJ communities in the state. And it remains to be seen kind of what emerges on the ground, in fact, from this bill, but there's a giant regulatory proceeding playing out at ARB to think about how to implement better protections. First of all, create a better data set to actually understand what the problem is and really focus on the locations where the problems of air pollution are most acute in California, and then to design tools to create health outcomes for the residents of communities that are heavily impacted that are better than we currently have. So that all sounds great. The ambition is large. There are some big challenges to getting there. We might not get there, right? I mean, I think that everyone has to be frank about that. The ARB intends to push as hard as it can, but of course, standing between the ARB and success is California's relationship with the internal combustion engine. And that is not something that will be, is not an easy regulatory problem, policy problem to manage. So then the wildfires happened. And I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the legal aspects of the wildfires and their liability to help you understand why they might matter for this broader picture of climate mitigation. So what are the impacts on utilities? Obviously, the impacts on real people. This is a picture of Santa Rosa, of the Fountain Grove neighborhood in Santa Rosa after the fires. There were a lot of impacts on real people. First of all, what are the causes of the wildfires? The Napa Sonoma fire, we don't know. CAL FIRE hasn't published a report yet. So we don't know. But what we do know in the publicly available record is that there were significant numbers of calls to the utilities because there were blackouts occurring during the windstorm as the fires were igniting. We know from publicly submitted CPUC reports that there were significant pieces of utility infrastructure, PG&E's infrastructure, that were impacted by objects that were flying through the air. You know, lots of so PG&E utilities have to file a report with the Public Utilities Commission whenever something more valuable than $50,000 is damaged in their system. There's a lot of those reports that have been filed with respect to the Napa-Sonoma fires. And they all suggest things like what you would expect on the ridgetops that night. I don't know if anybody lives in the North Bay from here, but or north of there, but I certainly woke up. I live in Mill Valley. I woke up on the night of the fires, and I thought the neighborhood was on fire. And the wind was blowing like crazy. And the next morning, there was debris all over our neighborhood. And of course, Napa-Sonoma was much more intense than that. And the reporting that's been done jointly with CAL FIRE suggests that large objects, trees, big oak trees, were flying 50 feet through the air and hitting utility infrastructure during the wind events. It would not be a shock if PG&E were at least partially responsible for igniting some or all of the fires, right? We don't know, but it would not be a shock. PG&E's stock is down 50% since the fires. Why is that, right? It could be that PG&E didn't do anything wrong, right? All of the reported damage on the PUC website suggests that the objects hitting utility infrastructure were far beyond the radius where PG&E would be held responsible. You know, where they were an object 50 feet away that hits a utility pole in a windstorm is not the utility's fault, at least so far as the commission is concerned. However, and I should just add, so causes. Let me just finish the causes. So it wouldn't be a surprise if utility infrastructure set the fire. Is utility infrastructure the cause? Well, you know, if this were normal litigation, we'd be thinking in sort of a reasonable duty of care framework, perhaps, foreseeability, did the utility follow applicable law, et cetera, right? It was an extraordinary situation in terms of the windstorm. The fuel conditions were extraordinary as well. Hard to see whether, you know, hard to say that the utility was it certainly was the cause of ignition, but are they liable? We don't know in a normal negligence context. Liability to date, something on the order, or the insured liabilities from the wildfires taken as a whole are about $12 billion. And that's the insured liability. Ask yourself if your homeowner's insurance policy would cover the replacement value or the fair market value of your home were it to burn to the ground today. Many people's wouldn't, especially if they bought their home a while ago, right? Homeowners insurance policies often are really about insuring the bank, not insuring the homeowner. So interestingly, in California, and this is, at least so far as our research has been able to determine a unique situation, utilities are subject to inverse condemnation. So that may or may not be something you've encountered in your practice, or maybe like this distant memory from real property law. Probably isn't. I think most of my property students forget most of what they learn within about 2 months. I'd love to test on that, you know, see the gradual degradation, but you know, what do you do? It's about learning how to be a lawyer as much as anything else. Inverse condemnation is the inverse of eminent domain, right? If the government comes and takes your house, they have to pay you fair market value. Everybody knows that. What if the government does something that causes your house to be destroyed? Well, the California Constitution says the government has to pay you fair market value, right? That's inverse condemnation. It's inverse because the plaintiff in that case is the property owner rather than the government, as in the eminent domain context. About 20 years ago, there were a series of decisions that held, appellate court decisions in California, that held that investor-owned utilities are enough like the government, they're quasi-governmental, such that they should be held to the same standard with respect to wildfires. So Investor-owned utilities, in the court's view, there were 2 appellate court decisions that were crucial on this, can socialize costs and rates, kind of like the government can socialize its own costs due to inverse condemnation in taxes. Therefore, utilities should be subject to inverse condemnation. What that means in court is strict liability, right? Did the utility wires cause the fire? If so, even if the utility was not negligent, it is liable for all damages that flow from that, including possibly things like mudslides. So PG&E, as a result, given the partial evidence we have now, is stock is down 50%, has suspended its dividend in late December, is in real trouble. And this is before we actually know the cause, right? Remember, there's no official cause yet of this fire. Interestingly, just a few days after the fires, SDG&E, Sempra, went before the Public Utility Commission and applied for cost recovery of the remaining liabilities associated with the Witch Fire. The Witch Fire was a fire that happened back in 2007 in San Diego. You may or may not remember it, but it was kind of the first of these mega fires where a really unexpected, intense fire behavior, lots of homes burned down that were not even in the urban wildland interface necessarily, but like sitting next to, in neighborhoods, dense urban neighborhoods next to the urban wildland interface. And there was about $2 billion of liability. Ultimately, after cross-claiming against Cox Communications, there's about $400 million. SDG&E went to the commission, and the commission said, you know what? We don't care about inverse condemnation. The utility code says we can only allow cost recovery if you were a prudent manager of your system. So that's sort of like a reasonableness standard. It's not entirely the same, but the prudent management standard is a standard that applies in the regulated industries context. And in the commission's view, Sempra hadn't been prudent, so they got nothing. This opens up sort of an interesting space between the judicial view, where utilities get to socialize costs, and the commission's view, where they might or they might not, depending on the commission's view of the behavior of the utility, both before the fire and during the fire. What are the implications here? Well, I'm not like an apologist for investor-owned utilities, but I do want them to do things in the world, right? If you're someone that works on energy and climate policy, the basic strategy for climate is clean up the electricity system, because we know how to do that, right? I just showed you some data that says we know how to do that. That's what we've been successful at in California. It's what the country as a whole is successful at doing. And then, rather than trying to, clean up the transportation system, just electrify it. Because if the electricity is clean and you electrify everything else, you've solved the climate problem. That's the basic strategy, the most fundamental strategy for reducing emissions in a significant way. If we have investor-owned utilities that are kind of mortally wounded in the state of California, it's going to be hard for them to raise capital, either equity or debt capital, to make the investments necessary to execute on that strategy. That's the concern right now, at least so far as climate goes. I should just say, this is not just a utility question, obviously. The perhaps as significant question is the issue of what we do about these people. Not so much these people, but the folks that live in the urban wildland interface, right? Like I do. I live in the urban wildland interface. I'm guilty. And to some degree, certainly probably my homeowner's insurance is subsidizing that risk at this point, given the way we regulate homeowners insurance in the state of California. Perhaps also my utility rates are subsidizing that risk. So in other parts of the country that worry a lot about flooding or hurricanes, right? This is a familiar conversation, right? In the National Flood Insurance Program, there's a lot of subsidization of risk and moral hazard, right? We underprice the insurance, we allow multiple loss properties to rebuild, et cetera. There's a long history of this conversation and the challenges of managing it. The thing to say is that California is rapidly moving in that direction with respect to fire. And there's some critical decisions that have to get made over the next year probably around how to manage the existing liability that's been created by the wildfires of the last season, and how to think about the prospective liability that exists out there in the world. I'll show you a snow curve in a second to tell you about the next wildfire season we're likely to see, but that's out there. In addition, there's just some basic availability issues of insurance, right? For utilities, PG&E went into the season having about $800 million of coverage. That was all they could buy in the market, because there was an expensive fire in 2015, and the insurance companies woke up to this and they said, we're not selling you policies for billions of dollars. That would be insane. It'll be interesting to see what they're willing to do after last season, right? How much insurance is actually available to utilities, or whether they're left self-insuring, or whether the state becomes the insurer of last resort, as is the case in Florida for flood insurance. Homeowners are going to be probably in a similar pickle, right? There's a number of availability of homeowners insurance in urban wildland interface is really becoming problematic, right? There was a recent insurance commissioner report about this. Placer County, where there was a fire in 2015, the Butte fire is kind of the epicenter of this problem, but it's going to be a bigger issue. And then finally, as the Utility Commission is waking up to this risk to the companies they're supposed to manage and keep healthy, they're starting to say things. Michael Picker, in a wildfire en banc that happened at the end of last month, said that his thoughts about this problem were that anybody who chooses to live in the urban wildland interface should pay for the risk associated with utility-caused wildfires by an extra adder in their utility rate. And the Utility Commission has spent the last couple of years developing very detailed maps of risk for wildfire. And there's at least a conversation where, rather than allowing for subsidization of the risk, the Utility Commission might say the people that create the risk should bear it, and they should bear it in their utility bills rather than on their insurance bills. Or maybe in both. I guess it would be both. So there are big questions about how we manage the risk, how as a society we're going to allocate this risk moving forward, and how that's going to filter down to individual land use decisions, right? Because these risks are of a sufficient magnitude to really raise questions about local land use planning. Where I live, anybody can build a house in unincorporated Marin County up on the hill in the eucalyptus trees, and it's no big deal. PG&E has an obligation to string wires out through those eucalyptus trees to the house. They have an obligation to serve. How do we manage that problem? There aren't answers yet, but this is becoming a very active discussion in the legislature. So I said, it's a planning issue. The other thing that these fires really brought up is that we don't know what risk mitigation to take. Houses that had done the right thing, and as far as the CAL FIRE recommends, burn down anyway. Right? It doesn't matter what you do if there is embers blowing out a half mile in front of the fire front. It doesn't matter if you cut down all the brush around your house and cleared it out. Your house is still going to burn down. There's also questions, and so then I'd just say to bring this back, how land use interacts with the insurability and obligation to serve on the part of the investor-owned utility, which it looks like for the Napa-Sonoma fires was at least a contributory factor. We know for the Thomas fire was, if not the cause, a contributory cause of the Thomas fire. SCE wires, at least there were two ignition sources for the Thomas fire. One of them was an SCE transformer. So how does adaptation connect with mitigation? Given that electrification is the key mitigation strategy, clean the power sector, electrify vehicles, electrify buildings, that's going to take a lot of investor-owned utility investment. In order to make those investments, investor-owned utilities have to have healthy balance sheets. And right now, they don't. I field a lot of calls from the investment community, which is trying to figure out what to do with this problem, right? The people that own the funds that own utility stock, it's supposed to be boring. That's why they own it, right? And California is way too exciting right now for the investment community. And they are trying to decide about how to manage this. The other problem is that California is too big, right? So you can't just take the California stocks out of your portfolio and say, we're only going to own the boring utilities. California is too big to do that. And Sempra, PG&E, and SCE are too large, too much of a fraction of the index to really just cut them out. So there's a real challenge here. This is just to show you, this is the snowpack today in the Sierra. So the green is the record. That's 82, 83. That's what I thought. That's, if you remember back then, I sure remember back then. That was a crazy winter. That's last year, the brown. So the second best year on record. The blue is average, and the sort of shaded blue. The driest years are down here at the bottom, and you can see that the sort of light, the darkish blue, royal blue line that cuts off about there, that's this year. So we're on track to set a record. And look outside, look at the medium-term weather forecast that says it's not going to rain for 2 weeks, and that's where we're headed. We're headed toward record territory, but not in a good way when it comes to snow water content in the Sierra, which is going to raise the wildfire risk. It's okay from a water perspective because we have that brown line, because we have a lot of water behind the dams. We're okay for this year. But it will mean that the forests in the foothills and the forests around here are extremely dry moving into fire season. And so this risk is not going away, right? And the need to have a healthy utility system, right, so that we can make those investments to achieve those incredibly ambitious climate goals is not going away. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation in the legislature. I don't have, well, I have thoughts, but I don't have answers about how to resolve this situation. It's interesting. I'll just note in closing that Florida Power and Light and Duke are companies that face a different kind of catastrophic, arguably climate change related weather risk, but it's there. And they have reached kind of formative agreements. They haven't worked out the details yet, but they've sort of agreed in concept. They have a term sheet with their utility commission to use the tax cut to fund their hurricane risk, right? And that's an opportunity I think that California needs to be thinking about. The commission kind of has already announced, the utility commission, that the tax cut is going to be used to reduce electricity rates in the state. That's one way to use it. Another way might be to use it to manage this risk, manage the liabilities that have been created and the prospective risk moving forward, because it's not going away. And personally, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I practiced land use law and got to interact with local governments, but I do not believe that we're going to convince local governments not to build houses in the urban wetland interface either. That's probably not a politically saleable proposition. Something we need to be thinking about. And I think that the good news is that the legislature and the governor are thinking about it. This is an issue they're taking very seriously, and they're not going to wait for one of the utilities to go bankrupt before something is done. But what exactly is going to be done and how it will work out, how it will interact with homeowners insurance, how it will interact with local land use planning decisions is TBD. So I should say this one thing to say, I just in wrapping up, climate damages emerged in 2017 as the key business risk for the IOUs. All anybody does at PG&E anymore is think about wildfire risk and how to solve it and how to manage it. And interestingly, in California, we've for a long time thought about how will we fund that seawall in the South Bay in 2050, right? It's like this long-term thing, like kick that can down the road. Maybe leave a little extra space in your specific plan for the seawall, right? This is not a next decade or next decade after that kind of problem. Because of the impact of the market dynamics, there's no way to kick this can down the road. And it's interesting for that. So we have a little bit of time, and I'd be happy to take questions if people have them. I hope you do.
I thought I heard recently after these fires that the emissions were greater than the amount that we saved in that year, and then going forward, would that be working against whatever gains we make?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So what are the emissions? I mean, first of all, if you live in the Bay Area, I guess all of you probably do, right? There were obviously some air quality implications to what happened. I got really familiar. There's this great website called Purple Air that has, they make an air pollution detector, and then the detectors are Wi-Fi enabled. You stick it on your house, kind of like a weather station, right? Probably people are familiar with that, and it measures PM. And you can go on Purple Air's website and see all of the PM detectors deployed in the entire world. There are about 50 of them in the Bay Area, and you get a very granular view. So you could say, what's the PM in my neighborhood? And should my kids play in the backyard today or not? And the wildfires were a major non-attainment event, which is one issue, right? Separate, I think, from what you're asking. But then the question is, we've thought, really, the story of the US thinking about climate change has been that forest regrowth is a net sink for carbon, right? And California has kind of assumed that without really having much information that we're kind of a part of that story, right? Our agriculture has intensified. We cut less timber than we used to. And forest regrowth is an important thing in California, as it has been more generally over the last several decades in the United States. How true will that be going forward? If you go to the Sierra today, right, especially the northern Sierra, it is not a healthy looking forest. And I think the answer to what are the emissions from fires like this, and especially when they occur in the Sierra where you've got more biomass to burn, and how do those compare to the things we're trying to do with fossil energy, with old plants that we dig up and burn, are as yet undetermined. There is a big effort. A part of the current planning process at the Air Resources Board is to get better data about this question. So there's something called the Natural and Working Lands Inventory proceeding, where ARB is trying to figure out both how to measure more accurately what emissions are from both wildlands and agricultural lands. It's hard to know what the emissions are from a field as well. And also, how to think about timeframes, right? Because obviously, if you just look at one patch, right, it might be a sink for a long time until it burns down, and then it's a big source. And so what are the appropriate scales, both spatially and temporally, to think about these problems? That's something that's a conversation that's happening at the Air Resources Board right now. Where it comes out is unclear. It's interesting, you may have heard that Oregon and Washington are also considering climate policy right now, enacting a cap and trade or a carbon tax. In Oregon, the whole picture depends very strongly where Oregon is in terms of its emissions on what you assume about forests, because there are not very many people in Oregon, there's a lot of trees, and there's a big timber industry, and particularly in the eastern part of Oregon. And what you assume about that industry as a source or a sink really drives everything about climate policy in Oregon. And the general, the happy assumption is it's a sink, but I think we don't really know. And certainly the fire regime that is developing, appears to be developing as we have these multi-year droughts, is going to change. It's going to have an impact.
Any more questions? Okay, here we go.
Going back for a moment from the issue of wildfires to climate change in general, I wanted to ask you for your thoughts, if any, about the issue of sea level rise, because San Francisco International Airport, in conjunction with CCAG, which is the County of San Mateo and several of the cities around the airport, and the Coastal Conservancy, are already planning for a 3-foot rise in sea level in the area of the airport. And the literature that I've seen is talking about an average global rise of 57 feet. And I don't know what the time frame, if that's after all the polar ice caps melt or whatnot, but I'm thinking about selling the house and buying real property 100 feet above sea level so my grandkids can have beachfront property when the time comes. And the policymakers that I've heard are talking about, oh, we'll fix the levees. I think you'll fix the levees. I'm seeing the whole Central Valley being underwater. I mean, is there, you know, are we planning adequately for this, you know, at all, or what's being done?
So the Bay Area and the planning, you know, that the city and county of San Francisco and cooperative governments are doing, I think is cutting edge. But it's totally inadequate, right? I mean, the reality is built infrastructure lasts a long time. And we have generally built our infrastructure assuming that the ocean is going to stay where it is. And it's not going to do anything crazy. Now, you know, if you go back into kind of deep time, right, you used to be able to walk out, the Miwoks could walk out to the Farallon Islands because sea level was that much lower, right? And the coastline we observe today is very different than it was even, you know, 10,000 years ago, 5 to 10,000 years ago. I work with, you know, one of the wonderful things about being in the Woods Institute is I get to work with a lot of climate scientists who actually are subject matter experts on things like the behavior of ice sheets. And what they generally say is that there is risk. There is very substantial and growing risk that sea level rise will be much larger than the 3 feet estimate, the 1 meter estimate. The 1 meter estimate generally comes from considering expansion of the ocean, right? If you warm something up, it gets bigger. So the ocean gets a little thicker, which means that sea level will rise. And it also comes from kind of modest sort of status quo reduction in size of the big ice sheets, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheets. What people are learning about those ice sheets is that they're more dynamic than we used to think. But we don't know how dynamic they can be, right? We don't know how fast things can change. What we see is an acceleration of change right now and an acceleration of retreat. And there's a lot of, this is a place where there's so much value in terms of risk reduction and in terms of local land use planning in investing in science, right? Like, I won't argue that all climate science is worth investing in. This part of climate science is incredibly valuable right now, and we don't know enough. It turns out that even like the shapes of the beds on which the ice sheets sit can have enormous impacts. If there's like a ridge, you imagine this giant ice sheet that's touching the ocean, what tends to happen is they melt back to a place where they get stuck. That's kind of intuitive, right? Like you can imagine things kind of, there are bumps and ridges and valleys in the bed of rock that this Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet are sitting on top of, and they retreat. The suggestion that's emerging from the science is they tend to retreat to a ridge and stick. So if you want to know how far they can retreat, you look for the next ridge, right? And you can start to get a feel for like where the next kind of sticky spot might be. And particularly for the dynamic ice sheets in the West Antarctic, kind of the place you might go if you're ever lucky enough to go to Antarctica, strongly recommended. I went there one time, it is totally worth the money, are pretty far back, right? They suggest that 3 foot estimate might be problematic, but then the question again is, on what time scale, right? If it's 50 years, that means one thing. If it's 100 years, that means another. If it's 300 years, that's probably a longer time frame than we need to plan for from a land use perspective, because we'll get there when we get there. That science is really not done, but there's risk.
Any other questions? Thank you, Michael, very much. Thank you.
My name's Brenna Moorhead. I'm a SPIRE member and on the committee for the Real Symposium, working with the sponsorship committee. And I just wanted to say another thank you to all the sponsors in the room for continuing to support this program. I think it's a great mix of professionals and lawyers. As I was listening to the panels earlier today, it was interesting to hear once again kind of the interplay between regulation, cost, quality of life, and how financing comes in to kind of bridge the gap and help make things possible. I think we'll see a very similar theme in this panel as well. Just to set the stage very quickly, I think most of you all probably know that as of January 1st, cannabis, certain limited cannabis-related activities, both recreational and commercial, were legalized in California. So what we now have are state agencies eager to regulate, local governments trying to quickly catch up, and federal, of course, still, I guess we're waiting to see what the federal government will do in light of the new regulations. So without further ado, I will introduce Art Cyrilek. He's a partner with Venable, and he is the chair of their Regulated Substances Committee. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thanks. I'd like to thank SPIRE and the Real Property Law section for having us. I'm just going to speak up here for a moment, then I'm going to move over. But I realize this is mostly a real estate group, and that this is probably a session you haven't necessarily sat in on before. I think we're going to try to keep it interesting. Fortunately, as I'll explain, we have a couple of former real estate developers on our panel as well. And so I think we're going to talk a little bit about how, how real estate and cannabis relate to each other. We have a pretty active program today. It's going to be mostly Q&A between me and the members of the panel. I'd suggest that if you have questions, let's hold them till the end. We may either have Q&A at the end if we have enough time. Otherwise, as we're the last ones here today anyway, we're happy to stay around and answer any questions. So with that said, I'm going to move over to that end and introduce everybody. I'd just like to introduce each person and let them speak for a minute or two about themselves, and then we'll kind of launch the program. To my left is Morgan Paxia. Morgan, you want to tell everybody about your background and your company a little bit?
Sure. So I am a co-founder of Poseidon Asset Management. We are a fund that's been investing in the cannabis industry since January of 2014. We've invested all over the United States, Canada, a bit of Europe, and we really came at this industry with the idea of, if you can even think back to 2014, just how limited the capital flow was, and just seeing this massive industry and this ocean of opportunity, so to speak. But there's so much, it's so fragmented, fraction, and the information wasn't there. And so we figured we could come into the space and really do the heavy lifting and understanding where to invest and how to invest. And that's really what we've done over the last, now we're into year 5 doing this. We've invested over 40 companies, and we've, very active in many different facets of the industry. But largely, I think I'd say our sweet spot has been around the ancillary components in the industry, and kind of like the picks and shovels. And I think it's unique to say something about that with California, and there's been so many parallels around the gold rush, right? And so when you look back to the gold rush, how many gold miners had built great businesses back then, but we all know about Levi Jeans and Wells Fargo. So, that was really our approach, but we've touched a lot of different facets of the industry because we do see this as an ecosystem that's largely cut off from a lot of the rest of the world, so to speak, because traditional providers are being held outside because of the unique regulations and still this stigma.
Okay, thanks. Next is my partner from Washington, D.C., Kara Ward. Kara, can you?
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. I'm visiting from Washington, D.C., where my babysitter was telling me that it's raining ice. So it's great to be here. I have a unique D.C. practice. I'm a lawyer and a public policy advocate, which usually translates outside the Beltway as a registered lobbyist. So I wear Scarlet L. I focus on banking and finance issues and housing issues. And I came to start to to look at cannabis issues as we looked at payment systems, and something that the federal government started launching probably in 2010, known as Operation Choke Point, that sought to kind of start to regulate using the banks and the payment system as a way to get to businesses that were operating legally in states but may or may not have had some sort of stigma attached to them. In my spare time, I focused on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because I was at the US Treasury Department during the financial crisis, and a lot of my clients are asset managers who are invested in the housing sector. So I do everyone from PIMCO down to America's Homeowner Alliance, and I help them navigate the DC waters.
Next is David Dinnenberg. David?
Yeah, hi. It's wonderful to be here today. I'm David Dinnenberg, founder and CEO of Kind Financial. We are a regulatory compliance company catering to the legal marijuana industry. We're also emerging now into the fintech side of this. And I've been in the industry, like Morgan, about 4.5, 5 years. And the only thing I actually claim to know is that the foundation of every heavily regulated industry in the world, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, firearms, gaming, pharmaceuticals, the foundation of all those is track and trace. And in our industry, we call it seed to sale. So we have a seed to sale technology where we can follow the life cycle of the plant from the day you plant it to the day you sell it in any form, whether it's oil extract or actual flower. We have a banking, compliance, and consulting technology company which is run by ex-bankers and ex-federal regulators, where we provide consulting and compliance services to financial institutions, as well as providing them technology that enables them to be in a very comfortable, compliant, actually over-compliant situation. And now our next generation is we're merging into payments. And we're launching that in Canada as we speak, and we hope to bring that to the United States in the very near future.
Okay. And at the end is Douglas Rosenberg.
Thank you. Douglas Rosenberg. I have 25 years of experience in the real estate business. In San Francisco, I was an early developer south of Market. And I've been retired for 10 years. I've done some different things, have an Alzheimer's project, have a sustainable ag business. A couple of years ago, I decided I thought there was an opportunity in the cannabis world. And so I'm now the founding chairman and CEO of Mesh Ventures, which is a cannabis manufacturing investment fund. And I say investment fund because we're not an operating entity, but an investment fund. So we're out on the street raising $25 million. And we studied the entire supply chain of cannabis, starting with nurseries, going all the way, so nursery and cultivation, extraction, manufacturing, fulfillment, branding, all the way through to retail dispensaries. And our sweet spot will be extraction, manufacturing, and branding. We can talk about reasons why we're going to stay out of cultivation and why we're going to stay out of retail. We think there are tremendous opportunities. We're happy to be here today. Appreciate the time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So as promised, as we have David didn't mention his real estate background, but David is a former real estate developer. And so I'm involved with a lot of people in the industry. I go to a lot of these conferences, and I continue to seem to be surrounded by either current or former real estate developers at a lot of these programs. And I was wondering exactly what it is that makes it such that real estate developers want to be in the cannabis business. And I thought, David and Douglas, maybe if you could both share your thoughts on, what led you from one to the other, and what the similarities may be. Sure. Any observations you have on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been out of the real estate business now for, God, long enough I don't remember, 6, 7 years. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it is, at least I can speak for myself, Doug, which is we did a lot of urban development. We did a lot of urban adaptive reuse, historic tax credits, new market tax credits. I guess everyone in the room would understand incredibly complicated deals. I've always gravitated towards the hard part of life, unfortunately. That's the way my brain works, problem solving. So whether it was repurposing an office building to a hotel or a condominium, or whether taking dirt and spending 3 years getting approved, after the crash, I really had to think about what I wanted to do in 2007, 2008, and I stayed with my firm until 12, but I knew it wasn't what I wanted to do anymore. I wasn't really in the real estate business anymore. I became a payroll guy, right? We had to bring on all the fees to make sure we made our overhead. I saw a 60 Minutes episode that I think it was 2012 that talked about the emergence of medical marijuana. It was at that point 16 states and under $1 billion of revenue. And really all I heard out of that 15-minute segment was the 10 seconds about all cash, no credit cards, no financial structure, no backbone. And really, it started as a research project for me. I said to my wife, I don't understand how these states can be legalizing this and the federal government's not acknowledging it, and all these problems that causes. And at the end of the day, ambiguity creates opportunity. And I wouldn't even call it a business plan. I wrote an executive summary, showed to a bunch of my friends and people who thought I was absolutely out of my mind. Thank God I found some group that I raised some seed money and moved to California, hired Venable, and the rest is history. I think there's your plug, by the way, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. It's Douglas's turn is next. So Douglas, while you...
Yeah, so I think, and I would say the reason maybe why a lot of real estate people are getting involved or interested in cannabis maybe is because in 25 years in the business, I ran into a lot of real estate people, and every one of them liked to smoke weed. So it's probably just a logical extension of everybody's personality. I think we like risk, we like to lead, not to follow, and we like to make money, and we like challenges, and I think all of those are true in this space. I think it's probably the most incredible opportunity, financial opportunity that I've seen in my lifetime, and I've seen now, we put a man on the moon, I've seen the development of the internet and the computer, and it may not be as big as that, but it's an incredible opportunity. And, so what we're trying to do is bring the right people into the space on our team that have complementary skill sets that allow us to, take real estate background. And we've had an opportunity to invest in real estate, and I'm happy to talk further about some of the reasons why we've chosen to avoid, and I'm actually pretty bearish on cannabis real estate, which may come as a surprise and may not be a popular statement here in this room, but I'm happy to talk about.
Yeah, we're going to circle back to that one a little bit later. Yeah. So, okay. So, Morgan, why don't you give us a little bit of, as you mentioned, you had investments in 40 different companies. Can you describe them a little bit and kind of distinguish between those that touch the plant and some of the ancillary
It's going to be
products?
41, by the way, when we're done this.
Okay. The differences and why, what's the rationale for the mix, why in one versus the other? So.
Sure. Yeah, so this industry has kind of divided itself in two different, in very significant buckets, where you have the so-called plant touching bucket, and there's a lot of different ways to participate there, which it could be from cultivation to product manufacturing to dispensary distribution, largely fit into that bucket. And then there's the ancillary bucket, which is, if you think of all the components supporting that, and there's technology, ag tech, real estate, data analytics, a lot of these components that, say, we always get this question all the time, especially since we do focus a lot on technology, is, well, why doesn't SAP do this, or why doesn't Microsoft do this, or why doesn't traditional technology just come in and do this? And simply is they're not. They don't want to mess with it. It's too complicated. We've seen off-the-shelf systems try to come in and get adopted, and it becomes overly complex, and then it defeats the whole purpose of technology, of making a business more efficient and get them back to doing their job of growing their business. And so we started working with technology companies, marketing SaaS-based technologies, a company called Baker, if anyone's heard of it. It's a really fast-growing company in the industry right now, to compliance, seed to sale, point of sale kind of investments, and data analytics. We think these are essential components from a compliance standpoint. We think compliance is a big driver of this industry because our support is behind companies that are trying to shepherd this industry forward in a positive and legitimate direction. We have no interest in supporting those that are not converting over to the regulated market. There's just too much risk there, right? I mean, we are representing our pool of investors, and we want to make sure we're doing right by them. So that's been an area that we really like that space, but we have also done work in the plant touching space. We have worked in limited license markets, meaning states where they only issue a certain amount of licenses to the various plant touching aspects. So even here in California, we've worked with some fantastic operators here. But when you're looking at those two different buckets, I could have a whole hour discussion on valuation depending on what you're looking at in the different spaces, and that gets even more nuanced to what specific markets you're operating in and what the regulations are like, because that has either impediments to growth or can be advantageous to growth. And from our vantage point is really understanding this entire landscape and how you start building this ecosystem that's largely being built by itself and not being supported by these traditional, very large enterprises.
Great, thanks. So Douglas has promised I'm going to get back to this other issue, which you've told me repeatedly that you have no interest in being involved in cultivation or dispensaries.
Yeah.
Can you talk about each of them?
So,
and I know there's real estate aspects to both of them.
Yeah. So I think, from a real estate perspective, some of the pitfalls that we see, deals that are being done with all equity. There's no traditional financing available, so you're going to see non-traditional lenders that are sort of hard money lenders coming in at those kinds of rates. And I think that's probably going to stay for the foreseeable future until federal laws change. I think the TIs in buildings are special purpose TIs. They're very expensive. As an example, power requirements for CO2 extraction equipment will dictate power requirements that as a landlord, you're not going to pay for that. Your tenants will pay for it, but because there's also very little credit in the market, when your tenants fail and they leave, you're potentially stuck with an albatross. So I think, and the lack of credit is likely to stay, again, I think until the federal laws change. And because when the federal laws change is when I think you're going to start to see the big players come in. And until that happens, the InBevs and the SAPs and the Constellation brands, you're starting to see some of the Canadian companies, Aurora and Canopy, that are coming down with cheap Canadian money, starting to aggregate businesses. But the really big players are staying out of the states until it's federally legal. And of course, we think that also creates an opportunity for companies like ours, ventures like ours, to come in and take market share and establish ourselves, hopefully, so that we become an acquisition target. I think there are political risks as well. Probably not the political risks that everybody thinks about, which is the elephant in the room, which is Jeff Sessions and the revocation of the Cole memo, which probably took all of you by surprise, but for those of us that have been living...
We're going to save that one for Kara, though. So
okay. And then finally, I think there are banking concerns, and there are, and then access to talent and labor, which we're setting up a production manufacturing facility in Oakland, and everything else that we see is being done in sort of tertiary markets, and the rents really aren't that much different in Coalinga and in Palm Desert as they are on our port property in Oakland. But in the Bay Area, we have access to this incredible pool of talent and labor, and I think that's a differentiating factor. So if you're thinking about real estate and you're thinking about cannabis, I think what we did is we looked at the entire supply chain and we looked for inflection points where we thought the risk-adjusted returns were where they should be, and looked for spaces that weren't crowded. And then from a real estate perspective, you're going to overlay the geographical filter and figure out where you think the best opportunities are.
Yeah. David, I know you wanted
I would
to
just
weigh
say,
in.
these guys are investors. So from an operator standpoint, why we don't touch the product, I can go all over the world. I'm not restricted by state law at all. If you touch the product, if you're a manufacturer, grower, or dispensary owner, the marijuana cannot leave your state line. And if you want to expand your business, you have to go to a licensing or franchising model to continue your brand growth. For someone who doesn't touch the product, we're in Canada, we're in Puerto Rico, we're in Colombia, we're in Australia. I don't have to worry about those things. So just want to give you the operator perspective.
Yeah. I do want to add a couple things. So we're staying out of cultivation specifically because cannabis has already become commoditized, and the price continues to plummet, and I'm not sure where the floor is. We've looked at models where we were going to cultivate indoors with protected grow systems. We think it's a low margin business. The dispensary business is different. The margins are greater, but there are impediments to growth there. There are localized markets that are controlled and permitted locally. There are limitations as to where you can operate. You can't be across from schools and hospitals. And then there are tax consequences as well. And when you're in the retail dispensary business, one of the tax benefits, one of the costs of doing business is the inability to deduct your SG&A from your tax bill. And so for retailers that have high overhead and high SG&A, that effectively will negate the benefits of the reduced tax rates. And so we're staying out of cultivation and we're staying out of retail. Great opportunities, but not for us.
So Kara, while we're on regulation, give us the view from DC. Okay,
Sure.
There's a lot of things going on. I'm not sure that everybody in the audience really knows. Why don't you give basically the fundamental, problem
Sure.
and what's been happening recently to affect that issue?
Sure. With apologies to my fellow panelists, but every time they're on a panel, I'm sure some version of a slide that I think we can put up here covers, what's the federal legal overlay on cannabis businesses. So it starts at the very top. Marijuana is still considered a controlled substance, which means that federal drug policy says that it's classified with opioids and cocaine and all those other kind of Schedule I drugs. So as an illegal substance, it means that any federal regulator still views it as an illegal substance. And that comes into the banking sector, where it means that any bank that's going to take in money that's associated with cannabis is going to be considered to be, for lack of a better term, it's sometimes called drug money, right? So you're not going to be able to transport that money through the federal rails system, so the Federal Reserve System, and that's bank-to-bank money. Now, certain banks we can get into the banking issues here in a moment, but federal banking regulators still recognize it as an illegal substance, so there's an issue there. The second is going to be in tax consequences. You were talking a little bit about this before. It's still considered an illegal substance, so that means you're basically being taxed on your revenue, not your profits. That drives some certain kinds of business decisions. As it continues, one of the things that people worry about is not just losing the value of their investment, but ending up in handcuffs, right? So under the Obama administration, they recognized that populist movements within states were legalizing cannabis for a variety of reasons, whether medical or recreational. And they decided that the Department of Justice was going to prioritize its prosecutions for things that it deemed more important than going after state legal businesses. That became known as the Cole Memo, which was so named after the Deputy Assistant General Counsel, or Deputy Assistant General, who promulgated, who signed it at the bottom. That Cole Memo is the thing that sort of kept the federal government off the backs of state legal businesses when viewed in the context also of something that followed it immediately from the US Treasury Department that handled some of the banking issues, that said if you're going to put this cash business into a depository that's insured by the government, then there's certain kinds of ways you can do it. We're not saying we're not going to give you a hard time about it or that we're always going to agree with it, but here's some ways to do it. Those two foundations were then supplemented and enhanced. These are non-binding sort of guidance from regulators by another law, which is part of the continuing resolution. Now we're kind of hearing more about that in the news today because the federal government's due to shut down in about 6 hours. But there's a continuing resolution appropriations rider. So every time the government gets funded, 2 senators or 2 House members will agree that says any money given to the Department of Justice may not be used to prosecute a state legal cannabis business as long as that cannabis business is operating only in the medical space. This is sometimes known by the names of the members of Congress who champion it. One is Rohrabacher here from California. He's sort of an interesting character. But that original piece of legislation carries the law of the land, but it needs to be renewed every time the government funding comes up. So in the last year, it's had to be renewed 14 times. And as far as I know, we were talking about this right before I came up, when I left DC, it was in the 15-page bill that was going to keep the government funded until March 22nd. The bill is now 650 pages, and I understand it's in there. Someone's supposed to call me if it's not.
You told me definitely before we started.
They're supposed to call me if it's not. Okay. So, but the ringer's on.
All right.
So that's the ground game.
And I would just add one thing. Both those memos, which I think we would all call the Bible in our industry, the last sentence in both of them are, this is guidance only and can be revoked and prosecuted at any time. So that's really what keeps the big businesses as well as the banks on the sideline.
I forgot the most important headline, which is Attorney General Sessions, who has been known as an anti-cannabis advocate for a very, very long time, very recently revoked the Cole, what I was just referring to as the Cole memo, which means that the Department of Justice is now able to prioritize cannabis-related businesses for prosecution. Whether they do that or not is an open question, and nothing to most of the attorney generals in most states says that they have now new permission to do it. So the story's yet to be written, but I don't have a lot of fear.
But at least as the Rohrabacher Amendment keeps getting renewed, at least for medical,
Correct.
it will trump, no pun intended, it will, the revocation of the Cole memo because there's no money available in the budget for the prosecutors to do it. But with rec, it's a different issue.
My personal opinion is, DOJ and FinCEN and all that, at the end of the day, the defunding portion of the budget is the most important thing to the industry.
Mm-hmm. So David, you took on the tough mission of trying to figure out how to bank cannabis money. You want to talk about your business a little bit, and what you're trying to tackle. This is, by the way, the holy grail of the cannabis business.
I advocate this all the time. We all read the newspaper or Facebook or Twitter feeds every day. Don't read the headlines. Don't read the headlines, and read the story behind the headline, especially in the cannabis business, and especially cannabis talking about banking. The reality of it is you can bank marijuana. How, why, and why would you do that? The reality of it is all bankers, just like most lawyers, they're in the de-risking business. That's what they do. I mean, banking is a very risky industry, but they try to mitigate the risk as much as they can. How do we do that? We created a system, at the end of the day, the most important thing that anyone can get comfortable with is data, right? So we happen to own a seed-to-sale business, right, which, like I said earlier, tracks the plant from the day you plant it to the day you sell it. So we know where it was grown, if it was made into oil, like where that whole plant went to. So we took that a step further. So, besides data, you need the people. We were very lucky that we have a number 2 guy from compliance out of FinCEN. His name is Tom Fleming. He's the chairman of our banking company. And then our president is a ex-banker certified anti-money laundering specialist. And what we did was we showed them all the data that we could possibly collect. And they looked at it and said, oh my God, there's more than enough information here that we could create something that we believe would make bankers who want to get into the space. Let's be clear, I can convince a lot of people to do a lot of things. I don't think I can convince someone who doesn't want to bank this industry to bank it. But if you're on the fence or you actually want to do it and think it's too expensive and impossible, you're my dream client, right? Because what we do is, we all know KYC, know your customer. Through our linear ecosystem, we control all that information. And we've created a piece of software that we call Blink, B-L-I-N-C-C, Bankers Linked to Cannabis Compliance. And it's basically a glorified anti-money laundering system. It looks just like a banker's anti-money laundering system. And we can provide not only KYC, but we can provide KYCC in real time. So why is that important?
Meaning know your customer's customer.
Know your customer's customer.
Right.
Because to be a state licensed cannabis producer or seller, you have to adhere to your state law. And whether that's a medical or recreational, there are several points that you have to comply with. If you're a patient, you only can buy a certain quantity. You have to be a certain age, and sometimes you can't buy your medicine or recreational product after certain hours, whatever the different nuances are. We can provide all that information in real time to the bank, and they get, if dispensary A does $1,000 a day, and then on this Saturday it does $10,000, they're going to get an alert. They're going to look at that customer, the pie chart will be red, they're going to get a text and an email and be able to say, oh my God, what's going on with my customer? And they can go click on it, see all the sales if they want to see the sales. They can call the customer and say, what's happening today that didn't happen yesterday? And at the end of the day, if you look at the FinCEN memo, and if you look at the old Cole memo, or we have a whole different internal interpretation of what that rescission actually means, we're actually very comfortable with it. We're making sure that the bank knows if, when, where, and why to file that SAR report, or when to call their customer. So at the end of the day, we can give, it's an information play at the end of the day. But it's more than that. You have to have the people who know what a bank expectation is and what the rules and regs really are. So by building the great team and providing that team the right information, we believe we can solve problems.
This is super important when you consider that all of these banks are generally going to be federally chartered or state chartered, but they're all going to be insured by the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is how the feds get into each one of these banks. And what they want to avoid is anti-money laundering or money laundering or being able to trace this kind of information. That's why this data is super important to them. Of the 12,000 depository institutions in the country, only 300 right now are raising their hand to say that they will openly bank cannabis businesses. 300. And at that, they generally are charging their depositors between $3,000 and $10,000 a month to bank that money so they can get through the expenses of the exams by the bank examiners. We recently at our law firm helped a bank in Colorado get through one of their first exams by the state chartering entity and by the FDIC. And without disclosing too much client information, the bottom line from the state, I think, was something to the effect of, keep doing what you're doing, bank, and just do what Venable tells you, because we don't have any rules on this yet.
Right.
And kind was important because they're able to trace this cash business that can't use credit cards or write checks.
So it also comes down to who your regulator is, right? I mean, you might have a cool regulator or an asshole regulator. And at the end of the day, you just never know, right? And the other part of it is, my favorite line, I hear it all the time, is we have this great idea. We're going to open a financial institution and we're not going to get FDIC insurance, so we're good. No. There's no shortcuts. I believe in my company's philosophy, no Band-Aids, true products that will last the test of time. I don't want to own a business that's going to fail when law changes. We've been nimble enough that we evolve as law changes. And there are a ton of shortcuts and Band-Aids out there. And my favorite is, people don't know this, when they call and tell me, oh, we're not going to get FDIC insurance. We're going to do private, da-da-da. And my next question is, do you know who actually who inspects you? And they all look at you like you have no idea. I'm a real estate guy. I don't even know anything about banking. The IRS investigates, examines non-FDIC insured banks. Good luck, have fun, you know? Like, these
So
people just
David,
don't get it.
we have a lot of ground to cover still, but there's one thing I want to just touch on further, which is, can you just talk for a moment about payment systems and stuff? We've been talking about banking, but let's talk about credit cards and stuff, and let 2 minutes or 2-3 minutes, okay?
You can't use a credit card in the marijuana industry. It's illegal. It's illegal because there is no SIC code for marijuana, whether it's recreational or medicinal. So at the end of the day, if you happen to go to the dispensary to get your medicine or to buy recreational marijuana, and you happen to swipe your credit card, that owner of that store is creating wire fraud every single time that card's swiped because it's either miscoded or they're lying to the bank. Either way, it's money laundering. That's the short answer.
Okay. Yeah, so don't go to a place that is taking credit cards.
But you can't get in trouble for swiping your card, just to be clear.
No, you can't.
If we get a chance, we'll talk about what you're doing in Canada. Let's see how we're doing.
But we have a solution for that, by the way.
Okay. Hey, Morgan, good segue. I'm segueing myself to Canada. I'm not sure how many people really know what the Canadian market is like here. Can you kind of talk about what's going on in Canada, how it compares to the US, what the markets are like, what the opportunities are like?
So Canada is federally legal for medical. They made that switch a couple of years ago now. I'm trying to remember when, but they're now on pace to become federally legal outright. It's the first G7 country to do this. So meaning medical and adult use. We don't like to use the word or term recreational, but so they're on pace to do that sometime this summer. Originally, everyone was thinking it was going to be July, but the reality is it's probably going to be a little bit delayed. But because of that, because they have federal support, it's created a very different capital markets dynamic than here in the United States. So here in the States, it's incredibly difficult to raise money for a lot of groups. I mean, if you're in a hot space at that time, money's raised. There's been a tremendous amount of money deployed in the U.S. for building out real estate for cultivation and dispensary because there's just a massive amount of square footage that needed to come online for regulated markets. But relatively speaking to Canada, we're a drop in the bucket. And when can you ever think of in the capital markets history where Canada is far outpacing the United States from a capital? And we're in that time right now. And for example, there's a Canadian investment bank just released their quarter a couple of days ago. It's called Canaccord Genuity. And they've, in the last 9 months, even in the last 3 weeks, they've raised a collective $1.8 billion for cannabis companies only, and in Canada. And so you have this marketplace where Canada is about the market size of California, but you have a federal government of Canada that prefers few and large, right? So they would prefer to hand out only so many licenses where they feel like they can have better control over them. And so they've raised a tremendous amount of capital relative to where their businesses are. We have companies here in California, their revenues, top line, are multiples of what some of these Canadian operators are having. They have so much more depth and understanding of their operations here in California. Valuation discrepancy is massive, massive, massive. So the largest quote unquote producer in the world is this company called Canopy Growth. About 3 months ago, they received investment from Constellation Brands. They don't do anything here in the United States. That was part of the deal with Constellation. Cannot touch the United States until laws change. But I think, up until about 3 weeks ago, their market cap was north of $8 billion, and they may have done $40 million in revenue in the last year. So just an incredible difference. And if you look at a California group that's doing 50 and 75 million, they'd be lucky if they got a $150 million valuation. So there's this massive spread. And something we always talk about at Poseidon is capital flows to where it's treated best, right? And so that is Canada is kicking our butt when it comes to the capital markets. And they're going to continue to do so because we have these headwinds out of Washington. A lot of it is perception-based, but that's all it needs to be, is because right now we're living off of memos, we're not living off of laws. And that's what banks want to see. They want to see laws to really step up. And same thing with investment banks. We talk to every major investment bank. They're dying to get in this industry, but there's not a chance they're going to do anything until the laws change. So right now they're just watching, they're getting ready. And as soon as that green light switches, they're coming hard and heavy. So for us, our whole play with what we're doing in the States, because we have invested, we've largely exited a lot of the positions up there because they're just, from the valuation perspective, makes a very compelling opportunity set in the US in the next couple of years. We think we've got a couple of years to make these strategic investments, and then that capital dynamic is going to completely rebalance, and you're going to see just a total level set.
Right. So 3 people on this panel are out raising money at the moment, I guess, and it's not Kara or me.
But I'll take it.
So Douglas, let's start with you. I mean, so Morgan just spoke to this fact there are tremendous opportunities. By the fact that it's still illegal at the federal level, there's a discount that's being attached to our businesses, which the premium is being realized in Canada. But yet we have all of these regulatory issues that are, in fact, overhanging all of this. Right. So what are you seeing? What are you hearing from your investors? Where do you see, the really potential benefits, the downside risks? And I'm going to ask the same questions to David and Morgan.
So we've been out on the street for about a month now, and we're raising $25 million. We've got 8 different investments we've identified. We have a home for all the money that we're going to raise with some reserves. I think that there's incredible pent-up demand, and if you're smart with a good strategy and you've got a good story and a good team, the capital is there. I think to Morgan's point about the impact of what's happening in Canada on the market here is the valuations on some of the companies that we've tried to buy are just ridiculous. I mean, these companies, we start talking and they're at 7, 8, 10, even 12 times revenue, and we end up making investments and buying them at somewhere between 2 and 3. And so, so we're seeing inflated valuations because the cheap money coming, and there are companies like Aurora is very active. It's a Canadian company. Canopy is another company. They're coming down into this market, and they're offering companies that we're investing in ridiculous money, and we say, look, we're not going to compete. We can't compete with that source of capital. It's just too cheap, and we're not going to play that game. We don't think these companies are worth 6, 7, 8, or 10x on revenue, and so the story we're telling our investors is, look, we're going to take our time. We're buying companies we think at the right multiples. We've chosen our lane. We're going to stay in it. We're going to be focused. And one of our big plays is to develop brands. And I think that it's something that when we talk about, and I think it's one of the reasons why we've gotten a really good reception. There are no dominant brands in the space today. And the brands you think are dominant, that are household names, you think Marley, Willie Nelson, Snoop Dogg, I guarantee you, and I know for a fact, Snoop Dogg would love nothing more than to have his name back. And so the people that are controlling what you think are major brands today are not doing them justice, and they're actually turning to people like us. We have a very deep branding company with people that are trained traditionally with Procter & Gamble and sort of being able to apply traditional Madison Avenue advertising and go-to-market strategies into this industry that is in its infancy and is really immature. So we're, the reception we're getting, I don't want to jinx what we're doing, but the reception we're getting is really positive, and the proof's in the pudding.
David?
Yeah, I would say that big picture, and whether Morgan and Doug agree or not, I would say, on this topic, but the plan is sexier than ancillary all day, right? I mean, if you want to see a nice pop, I think especially earlier in the life cycle, more money went to the plant than went to ancillary businesses, whether that's software, security, whatever that other might be. We've raised over $5 million over the last 3 years. The difficulty that we have and we're seeing is the individual high net worth, the investor from 100,000 to 500,000, they're there. But we're in growth stage and expansion stage, right? So we need a slug now, as opposed to $1 million here and $1 million in 6 months and $1 million in a year. So when you start going for the larger numbers, I think that that makes the investment world smaller, first of all, and we're competing against, quite frankly, the plant. And I think that we've done a very good job by building a superior team. We've done a great job, just as good as creating great partnerships. So we're Microsoft's partner in this industry. We have 2 bank partners. We have the largest privately owned bank in Canada. We have a federal chartered bank in the United States. And we're built for the long term. We're not built for short term. So, I'm not going to do a deal with Doug because I'm not basing my deal off of today's revenue. We look at this as a long-term global play. And the only really way to fight with startups, to Morgan's point earlier, where all the big money and all the traditional companies are on the sideline, by having our 2 banking partners and by having Microsoft, especially Microsoft, when I call Germany or Australia or Spain, no one knows who Kind is and no one knows who our competition is, but everyone knows who Microsoft is. So I think as it gets more sophisticated, we'll find the right investors to come along for the ride with us. But it's a long-term play.
David, I want to go ahead. Douglas.
Yeah, I want to add one thing, and that is, being a real estate person, the financial structure of our fund is a waterfall structure, which I'm sure everybody in this room, if you know, is return of capital to a pref, and then splits the threshold level returns above that. And so that's the structure of our fund. We're not taking the dartboard out, trying to justify a valuation on companies that really don't justify a valuation. And we've seen people that come, I've seen 100 decks in the last 2 years, and 99 of them have all been, half of the time that we spend, the people are trying to get us to buy off on the valuation, and we look at these valuations and we think they don't make any sense. So I'm taking my years of real estate. We're setting our fund up as a waterfall. We think it aligns the interests of our partners with us as the sponsor, and so if you probably all are familiar with that.
Thanks. Hey, David, I want to come back to you in a second. I gave short shrift before to the credit card stuff, and I want to talk about, maybe if you feel free to, what you're incubating up in Canada and stuff. Sure. But first I want to get with Morgan on his views on the challenges of fundraising right now. I know there's some types of investors that you just aren't going to come in, and maybe you can speak to that a little bit and what where you see the benefit and the risk.
Yes. Yep, so the funders of the cannabis industry right now are high net worth individuals and family offices in the United States. That's all you're going to get. There's nothing more than that. As I mentioned about the investment banks, even fund of funds, even large family offices that are quasi-institutional. There's this, once you get to a certain size, there's this perception change about how you can operate. And so, again, it comes back to those individuals and the high net worth, which has been fantastic or in the family offices. And they've been fantastic, right? We've made tremendous strides in this industry, from legitimizing and capitalizing an industry that's growing at, 30% plus year over year for the foreseeable future. So, I mean, this is just we are in growth mode. Challenge is, as the numbers get bigger, we're still in this relatively same capital pool, right? And so, where we're trying to raise our fund, we have the same investors that are looking at our pitch deck, they're looking at Douglas's pitch deck, they're looking at David's pitch deck. They're all the same people looking at the same opportunities and just trying to decide how they're trying to invest, whether or not they're trying to play direct or if they're trying to delegate to a fund manager. And that's fantastic, but the problem is, so right now we're trying to raise a $100 million fund. Trying to do that on $500,000 checks is an awful slug, and we're battling it out because that's the market we're in. But you can imagine how challenging that is. So we are actually spending more time going to Canada because we can have those discussions of investors that are looking at $15 to $25 million investments. It's unfortunate that we have to do that. We're in this environment, but again, as I mentioned before, capital flows to where it's treated best. I mean, the good thing about Poseidon is that we've been in the market for so long, we've been invested in so many companies, we do have some global visibility. So when we do go to international markets, people know who we are. It's kind of funny, we were just in a French documentary, so like right now our website is like exploding with people from France that are wanting to invest, which is great, but again, it's they're like $50,000 or $100,000, and so there's just these challenges, and that that kind of pressure is going to stay like this until we get some movement, and that's what Kara's working on.
Yes, I'm going to come back to all of you in a minute because I want to, we talked about the Washington issues, but I want to circle back to them again to ask each of you how that's affecting your fundraising. But before I forget, David, just you comfortable talking about what you're doing up in Canada as far as payment systems? Or?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So Canada is a microcosm of the United States. So where we have thousands and thousands of banks, they have a handful of banks, especially the large ones. There's really 10, I would say 7. They don't touch the industry. They don't allow credit card transactions. Just like here, a lot of the large banks own the processing networks. It's very unstable up north. Why is that? It's all because of the United States, right? I mean, RBC, TD, all these Canadian-based banks, they do too much business with the United States banks to risk that on a $1 trillion economy for, in Canada right now, a $500 million industry. It's just not worth it to them. So we partnered with the largest privately owned bank in Canada, which also happens to be a sponsor and acquirer of Visa and MasterCard. So we have the unique ability to create the ultimate platform for the Canadian producers. So we took our seed to sales system and we actually partnered with Shopify, which is a Canadian-based company, and we created the first seed to payment system. So now the patients in Canada will be able to have a seamless payment shopping experience. Once again, you got to understand Canadian market. Unlike the United States, there are no dispensaries in Canada. Everything is...
No legal dispensaries.
No legal dispensaries, correct. Toronto and Vancouver try very hard. Everything's e-com, and it's actually delivered by Canadian Post. So just the exact opposite of here. So what we've done is we're creating a very stable ecosystem in Canada, which quite frankly can be used anywhere in the world today other than the United States. But that answers your question, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to just circle back a little bit on the regulatory climate, and then I'd like to go to, I think, what the solutions are. How do we stay on the right side of things? And so, from Morgan, let's start with you. How has the revocation of the Sessions memo affected it? Are you losing potential investors that were otherwise ready to go? And then maybe, Carrie, you can talk about some of the more recent developments. We've got, Secretary Mnuchin's comments on some issues, and and I'd just like to kind of go down the line with that, and then let's talk about maybe finish up by talking about compliance a little bit. Okay.
So the Sessions effect of rescinding the Cole memo certainly it sent some reverberations, right? And it wasn't just through the U.S. It did flow through to the international markets as well, and. We've been investing in this industry since before any of that existed, since before Cole Memo, since FinCEN, since Rohrabacher, FARB, Blumenauer, and but it certainly, what it did was the 300 institutions that exist in the space, some of them just dropped right out. They shut down accounts. It did scare away we were starting to get some of these quasi-institutional capital pools that were getting comfortable with the situation, because last year was largely uninterrupted, right? We had a tremendous amount of progress. California legalized, Massachusetts coming online, Nevada opening up, a lot of really great progress in the industry, and with largely few hiccups. So, these investors were starting to get pretty psyched up, especially because some of their billionaire buddies are doing it themselves too, and they're showing them their pretty plants. Is the idea of the sexier part of the industry is in cultivation, but that's perception, right? I think there's actually far greater growth potential outside of that. But the Sessions effect did ripple through Canada and the Canadian capital markets as well. It chilled that marketplace as well. Some of these big, multi-billion-dollar market caps, came down something like 35% in just a couple of trading sessions. It was a great short opportunity, but we're seeing some stabilization there. But one of the stock exchanges that was more open to U.S. operators listing up there, even kind of put a timeout on that market. We just got news today that they basically said it's okay. You just have to be disclosed, proper disclosure, which is great for lawyers, a little more legal activity there.
TSX?
CSE. TSX did get a little more aggressive with one of their operators that was listed there, Afria, that had U.S. assets, and basically said, you got to get rid of these assets. And so they've been divesting of those assets. So it's not just acute to the U.S., but one thing that we are going to continue to watch closely, because this does impact the investor base, is Rohrabacher Blumenauer, if that stays protected. There's a lot of big money that's watching that. That's one of the big components, and also FinCEN, because Cole Memo, is for what it wasn't as impactful as the Rohrabacher and the FinCEN, because FinCEN is really the big hook for banks to stay in with banking the industry, and so those that got flushed out were clearly not in the risk tolerance mode to be even taking cash deposits, and so they got flushed out of the system. That's fine. We're going to have plenty of others. And it has been great to see some bank institutions actually come back, almost reinvigorated on the backside of this, because you've seen a very bipartisan, almost outcry from even very, very conservative states of saying, you're not coming after my state, or we are going to move forward with legalization. And so that's reinvigorated some capital pools, but they needed to see a little bit more stability at the federal front, and then we think that velocity of money will start to pick back up again.
Just to tee something up a little bit, we've been talking about the Cole Memo and we've been talking about the FinCEN guidance. The Cole Memo is basically, we're not going to prosecute you if money's, if it's in the proceeds of transactions are being generated in a heavily regulated state that implements their rules. It's not being sold to children. It's not being shipped out of state. It's not being used to be diverted to terrorism, gangs, etc. And what David has is his system tries to track all of that to prove it by going right back to the source of the money and stuff like that. The FinCEN guidance, which is what we're talking about, where there's a statement by FinCEN, which is Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, for those of you who don't know what FinCEN stands for, said...
It's part of the Treasury Department.
Yeah, part of the Treasury Department.
Yeah, they track terrorist money. Yeah.
Based on those same principles, we think if you can demonstrate all of those things, you should be able to bank your money. It makes sense. It's not good to have all of this cash floating around the system. It's not taxed. It's just good for the U.S. to do that. And there was a question as to whether, since the Cole Memo and the FinCEN Memo are both based on the same principles, how the revocation of the Cole Memo affects FinCEN guidance. And maybe you want to talk about that in Secretary Mnuchin's comments and stuff.
So earlier this week on, today is Thursday, so Tuesday. I'm trying to remember what day of the week we are in. On Tuesday, Secretary Mnuchin appeared before the House Financial Services Committee.
And you were there, right?
I was in the room to testify about something somewhat unrelated, the Financial Stability Oversight Council report. And in a approximately 3.5-minute exchange, a congressman from Washington State, the Seattle area, pinned the Secretary Mnuchin into a clever question and answer, which said, what are you going to do with this guidance that the Treasury Department has on cannabis-related businesses depositing their money? And Secretary Mnuchin wasn't prepped for the question and said, I want to choose my words carefully, but I don't have any plans to move that right now. He's on the record, which means I think your business was able to take some comfort in that. as a DC insider.
Well, I think he said, if I recall correctly, like Jeff Sessions didn't coordinate with us or something to
Correct.
that effect, and we believe it's still good to bank cannabis money, right? I believe something
Well,
to that effect? Or?
Yes, that he wasn't going to be revoking the FinCEN
Until he
memo.
had a policy to replace it, if he were to rescind it.
Correct. Some of that was his word salad, though, because I don't think some of that doesn't make sense in the way that the Treasury Department works. I will say this, though. He's on the record now having supported at least the status quo on this memo. So what does that mean is there's sort of a couple of headwinds inside DC for cannabis-related businesses, and they're coming from the well-organized ground game of pharmaceutical companies, the insurance industry, and alcohol and tobacco. That are sort of lined up against it. And so, but cannabis has the tailwind of populism. You know, they have members of Congress who are willing to accept these businesses in their congressional districts because of the promise that they have for increased revenue and legalization generally as a civil rights issue. So I think over the next few congressional sessions, and I think of the world in 2-year increments, I think over the next, I'm going to say 6 years, you're going to watch Congress and watch the regulators who have fingers that are outside or control centers that are more outside the beltway, like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, are moving from negative to neutral. I think the FDA is already there. I think the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has moved from negative to neutral, which is, in my book, a win. Which we've got to watch is the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is inside Treasury. They regulate the major banks. And then the credit unions and the FDIC and the Federal Reserve to start move from where they are, which is slightly negative, to neutral. And I think between Congress and the regulators, we're going to see the real change.
Okay. David? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Morgan. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just, the SEC thing is really interesting because, so, you know, the IPO market in the United States is terrible, right? Last year was like one of the worst years ever for IPOs. NASDAQ has actually been coming to the industry and saying, if you are a technology company, you can list here. We'll let that happen. And my sister's actually on the board of a SPAC. I don't know if anyone's familiar with SPACs, but it actually began trading on the NASDAQ. And it's this, you know, it's this vehicle that they have $57 million that they can go out and buy a cannabis technology company. And so right now they're as the board, they're deciding what company to buy. And so, you know, that is really a pretty amazing step forward for our industry, especially with this capital challenged area we're in. If the IPO market can be reinvigorated by this industry, I mean, that is a fantastic story. And so it's really excited about that progress there.
Douglas, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I do. So I'll give you the name of what I would consider to be the poster child of a real estate, a group of really smart, Wall Street educated, trained real estate people named Calyx Development, K-A-L-Y-X. And they're smart and they're diligent, and their strategy was to purchase warehouse properties all over the country in legalized markets and aggregate them, and their exit strategy was through the public markets and a REIT. And everything was marching along, and they're doing deals at, you know, unlevered deals at 18%, okay? And so even at 18, you can borrow hard money at 12, and that still begins to make sense. Of course, you're still gonna end up with sort of price per pound issues that the market's just never gonna give you those kinds of valuations. And the reason I say they're a poster child is because for 18 months, they were processing their public offering with the New York Stock Exchange, and the current administration was elected, and within 60 days, the DOJ called the stock exchange and said, tell them no. They're done, they're out. And so smart real estate people, they know their business, thankfully, they bought good property and good, you know, and didn't rely on 18 cap deals. So they're probably going to be able to find a way out. But and I mentioned earlier, the political risks in this industry sort of coming at different angles. That's how it's the Sessions memo, the Sessions being the elephant in the room, I think is really not going to impact our business. But from a real estate perspective, I think the impact of the DOJ and the direction they're giving the public markets is where the biggest impact will be. And you can look them up. There's the Calyx people are really good people. They know what they're doing. Look them up. You'll see. You'll see the.
So I want to bring it home with one issue, and we're going to try and set aside some time for Q&A. Let's see if we can get this squeezed in the next couple of minutes. If not, everybody's around still, and we can take your questions afterwards and stuff. Compliance. Okay, I know everybody believes in it here. Why don't we talk about it a little bit, and how we see that driving the industry. David, you're a compliance company, so why don't we start with you?
I don't want to sound self-serving, but the reality of it is, the more regulated the industry becomes, the more important compliance protocols are. I started in this industry, in 2013, moved east to west and started the business, and we launched it in 2014. And I used to talk to people all the time, and they hated compliance. They wanted nothing to do with compliance. They wanted to sell and buy and grow and, be happy as horse shit, selling marijuana out the front door. And I used to say to these people, like, I don't understand. You want to wake up every day and have that chance to go to jail. Why do you want to have that feeling? It's like anything else. It's like pharmaceuticals and alcohol and gaming, right? I mean, we might not know it as the consumer, but as the owner, operator, or employee, these are incredibly regulated industries with tracking and tracing people and money and everything in all these places. So that's my answer to compliance. It just becomes more and more important. I would also say that if you want to grow up, and I think last year in this industry, what was it, $8 billion industry, Morgan? And probably with California this year could be anywhere from 15 to 20. Who knows the answer? But what if we had banking? What if we had credit cards? And what if the federal government legalized this? I mean, there's so many topics to talk about around marijuana. It's like anything else in the world. Decriminalization. I mean, California decriminalized it. California's letting people out of jail on parole. I mean, the cost savings of legalizing this substance. There's so much we could talk about.
Morgan, I know that when you're reviewing a lot of different investment opportunities. Can you tell me from a due diligence perspective, kind of what issues you're looking at?
Sure.
And how that ties to compliance and stuff?
Yeah, so we have had the benefit of investing in so many companies over the years now. 40 companies, as you can imagine, we've amassed a tremendous amount of data on a lot of different areas of the industry and a lot of P&Ls and balance sheets and how these businesses are running. And it's really easy to look at a business, and if their profit margin is X, they're not playing the game right. They're certainly cutting corners. So we are going through, we have a whole due diligence checklist to make sure that they have all the traditional protections in place, insurance, compliance, that they're paying their taxes. Because this 280E issue, we really haven't gotten to dive into that. That's a highly challenging issue for this industry. And one of the big challenges around compliance, though, is tied to taxation, I would say, because these businesses are so highly taxed that when you go to them and say, okay, now here's another thing you have to pay for in order to be compliant, there's an aversion to it, so they don't want to do it until they have to, right?
Right, yeah.
And like California, we saw this. We've been professing to so many companies we've worked with that you need to embrace these systems if you want to be competitive going into a regulated landscape. And now that they're feeling the pressures of regulation, now they're like, oh my gosh, now we got to figure out what's happening and what's our competition doing and how, and data can do this, technology can do this, that's ready to service this industry. But, on the same token, we need to be fighting the tax issue is, yes, we want to be regulated. We also want to be taxed fairly as an industry to be competitive and to effectively drain the black market and let these regulated businesses perform normally and embrace these services and solution sets that will keep them synced up with the state so they can stay permitted and licensed.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I can
I was going to add one thing, which is we regulate the state of Rhode Island. So California has a system. There's probably, out of the 29 states right now, there's probably 12 systems in place, 13 systems. So we have the one in Rhode Island. DOJ never called the state of Rhode Island prior to rescission of the call memo. Two, I speak to these guys once a week, the guys who run the programs. They're looking to expand it. They're looking to make it easier for the patients and home grows to be able to participate. So I do think the state governments are looking at this the right way, and it's been an amazing ride, because if you start with Colorado and Washington and see how it started, and then Nevada, which is the most regulated state in our country, they brought lab testing as a requirement at the state level. And then everyone backfills, and now everyone requires lab testing. So it's truly the great experiment, and we all learn from each other. I think the businesses learn from each other, the investors learn from each other, and quite frankly, the states are all learning from each other. So,
Final thoughts,
So,
Douglas,
yeah.
30 seconds each of you. Let's just wrap it
The
up.
cost
so that
of
we're getting
compliance is ultimately driving the cost of cannabis products up. And what we're seeing is brands are dropping off the shelves like wildfire because of the cost of compliance, and people have been living in the dark side and the black market for so long. And so these companies and these brands are just literally disappearing in front of our eyes. So, regulation is good. We want it. But the cost of compliance is almost onerous to the point where just real quickly, like a pound of biomass that a company will buy to produce oils. 5 years ago, they would give it away. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, you could buy it for $5 a pound. A year ago, you could buy it for $50 or $60. Now it's $120, but there's a $44 per pound tax on top of that. Okay, it's just as an example.
That's California.
Okay,
specific.
California
Doug,
specific. We're running out of time. David, final thoughts.
It's a great industry. It's not going anywhere. Don't read the headlines. Seriously, read the information behind the headlines. Do your research. It's a viable, at the end of the day, if someone was in the Amazon today and found this wild weed and brought it back to the United States, it'd be known as the miracle plant. And at the end of the day, I was someone who grew up in Philadelphia who moved west, and I will tell you that I thought medical marijuana was the biggest joke in the world, and it was just a way to start selling an illegal substance. And I will tell you, and Morgan, I think you would agree, being in the industry for as long as we have, in the earliest stages of this industry, the businesses were owned by people who used it as medicine. And I've seen the results, and I am a true believer in it, and it's going to be here for a very long time. It's not going anywhere.
Thank you. Kara?
I'm bullish on privately held REITs to hold cannabis property. And I think that the first shoe to drop for legalization is not going to be national legalization of cannabis. It's going to be the banking laws.
Morgan?
I would say, we're not going anywhere. The federal government can try to do what they're going to do, but we're going to fight through it. This is happening. This is a global story at this point. We're seeing real change. We're seeing betterment in people's lives. We're facing a opiate epidemic that is, unfairly, cannabis is getting pulled into that as a blame, which is unbelievable misinformation. And so we're fighting hard to, show that it's actually, we're helping that problem.
25% reduction.
Yeah, and you look at these states. And so, for us, the industry is growing tremendously fast. We're going to keep doing the hard work. And for those looking at it, this is one of the great growth stories of our time right now. And we have we have this special moment in time where we still have a great opportunity.
Christine, we have time for M&A or
I have time
Q&A?
for questions.
Excuse me, M&A is what I do for a living. Sorry about that.
Questions.
So to tie together the questions about compliance with the real estate theme here today, as a land use attorney, I'm really interested in the way the state and local regulatory landscape is fitting together here in California. And maybe this is the case in other states too, but in California, the state has really left it to local jurisdictions to decide whether they are going to completely prohibit commercial cannabis activity or allow up to what the state is allowing. And there's just a huge range right now, a real patchwork of different local laws. I'm just curious, how the industry is sort of viewing that patchwork, how the current regulatory landscape is affecting the industry in terms of the real estate and land use questions, and whether there are any focal points for the industry in trying to change that current landscape.
Morgan, you want to go first, and then
Sure.
maybe Douglas? Okay.
Yeah.
And then, by the way, Jeff, if you want to weigh in, Jeff is my partner, a land use attorney, so it's.
So first, I would say California Cannabis Industry Association, CCIA. They're representing a lot of the interests at state level, working closely with Lori Ajax and her team. So the state tried to do everything they could to get this program going on time, which they did, understanding that there is a lot of that flow through to the local jurisdictions that can have a lot of additional friction. And so we're seeing exactly that playing out. I mean, companies trying to get permitted and licensed right now, depending on your local territories, it can be very, very frustrating, very prolonged. It has impacts to the supply demand right now. We know very established groups that are in actually an extraction that sell like vape pen cartridges. Their volume from what they're able to source from the legal market now is down something like 90% because their local jurisdictions are so far behind in getting permitting out. This is going to be a problem for a while because these local areas are still trying to figure out what exactly they want. The state went fast to get this program out there, and it's going to take more time before a lot of this industry is fully functioning. I mean, we think it's anywhere from 12 to 18 months because we haven't even touched on the issue of testing and the bottlenecks that's going to play into this, to the California
Douglas,
industry.
you're living this a little bit, right?
I mean, I think they're literally writing the laws as we speak. And so what you think is the law today, tomorrow will change. Distribution, for example, we were brokering deals, buying biomass for companies for the last 18 months. That's illegal to do. In order to do that today, you have to have a distribution license. So that creates another set of hurdles, and it's another business, and yet it's another permit that's required. And so literally, I mean, the uncertainty at the state level that's trickling down to the local level, which is where the permits are actually issued, creates a bottleneck. And as Morgan said, I mean, the supply-demand relationships are completely out of whack right now.
And I would just add this. California is no different than the other 29 states. They all have state laws, and a lot of them have their own local jurisdiction laws, from hours of operation to where you can open and not open. So California is just on steroids, right? It's just magnified by so much more. So yeah, it's not, my answer is it's not uncommon to California, or it's not just common.
Anybody else?
Kind of piggybacking on that question. Thanks. That fragmentation that we're talking about and all the different licensing jurisdictions, that to me sounds like a real estate opportunity, right? For somebody who can figure those systems out, aggregate the properties, you mentioned sort of private REIT models. Is that happening? If not, why isn't it? If it is,
you can't borrow money.
Well,
but there's so much money in the industry already that I'm seeing a lot of deals where they don't need the lender component. So is it just that it's too fragmented?
So one of a REIT problem that would need to be solved is the tax issue, right? So one of the reasons that REITs are an advantageous vehicle is because of the pass-through treatment that they'll get, and it'll be even better. Except if for whatever reason the income that's generated by owning the property needs to be proved to be state legal, it's living in an IRS like gray area, which needs to be solved, and it needs a really great legal opinion to run that privately REIT. But the equity is probably expensive and
But it's
needs
also
a
one
huge
step
return.
further, which is your tenant's paying you in cash.
Yeah, there's
Your
that
bank's
too.
not going to take that deposit, right? I mean,
Right, but that's the same problem the whole industry faces.
absolutely. But you're talking about real estate and a REIT and all different kinds of things. So it's a different question, different answer for you. It's the same answer for a different question. The problems are consistent, right? And I think that goes back to why these two guys are here, which is they're raising the money to make these investments, whether it's an operating business or whether it's bricks and sticks, right? Because traditional debt doesn't exist and traditional banking doesn't exist. So yes, it's an opportunity. Does the opportunity have a fuse? I think that's the underwriting you'd have to look at.
So real quick touching on that. So when you're looking at real estate in this industry, you have to model it as if you don't have a cannabis tenant. That you're not going to get that
Second generation,
that 30% premium on it. There's a town in California, I'm trying to remember which one it was, they were a medical town, and then they decided no more. And there was businesses that invested millions into that jurisdiction that are gone. So, just the idea that it's definitely not a slam dunk. There's a reason why the cap rates are high. You're justifying for the risk of losing that tenant, the TIs that you might lose because, everybody has their own secret sauce of how they want their space built out. And so they're going to rip all the lights out and rip all this stuff out, and you're going to start all over. So That's, so it's, you got to know what municipalities you're working with, and is it going to stay as a favorable environment? And then, maybe it makes a little bit more sense to invest, but, certainly I would think about your exit or being able to build off of other kinds of markets that you could service in that piece of real estate.
Also, keep in mind, federal bankruptcy law may not protect you.
Oh, yeah. We had to deal with that.
So there's,
And I would add, like the real estate that we're developing, we're not developing it ourselves in Oakland. It's actually on port land, which from a permitting standpoint gives us a decided advantage. We had an opportunity to buy the building and to develop it ourselves, and we opted out of it. Why? Well, first of all, we're a cannabis business. We're in that business. I'm not in the real estate business. And the returns that we looked at in this building were, sort of mid to high teens, which I think from a real estate perspective are respectable returns. I always returned generally higher than that in deals that I did for my investors, but they pale by comparison to the returns that we're looking at in underwriting in our industry. So, I think there's a lot of, the cap rates in real estate these days are so low that I'm sure a mid-teens kind of return looks attractive. And there are opportunities out there to do that, but I think it's the permitting side of the equation. Again, we have an advantage. We're on port property, and so we're not beholden to the Oakland City Council for our permits and our approvals.
Was that an unleveraged 16?
We actually had leverage from one of our partners to carry back some percentage of it at 8%. So,
Christine,
yeah.
we need to wrap up, or can we keep what it's?
One more question?
There's one right here.
I just had one follow-up question to his question, because I've heard a lot that there's sort of overproduction right now, and that from a real estate perspective, we're already growing more pot than we could ever smoke or eat or whatever we want to do with it. And so my question is just like, is there from a real estate perspective, isn't that a huge risk that, you're going to lease out your land and these guys are they're just not making enough money on the pot anymore, or they're not going to, and that they're just going to kind of fall away. So just from a pure, the real estate side of the investment, is that something you see as really problematic?
So I want to address that. There are certain markets that I think that are bubble markets. Santa Rosa, the warehouse market in Santa Rosa, as an example, have seen prices double or tripled in the last 18 months. The Oakland market, same thing for warehouses. Everybody wants to bet they're in the green zone. Everybody wants to lease their building to cultivators. Again, we're staying out of the cultivation business because from a permitting standpoint, it's the easiest permit to get. Okay, the more difficult permits to get are type 6 and type 7 extraction permits for that type of business. So you can get permits to grow, and there's been this sort of mad dash to the finish line, which I describe as the mad dash to the starting line. And so I think there in the short term is an oversupply of cannabis flower and bud coming into the market. And you're actually starting to see people grow plants strictly for extraction, taking the entire plant instead of not just the trim, and using that for extraction to extract the oils. So I think the market is saturated.
There was an article.
If you're talking about California specific?
Yeah, I was going to say, there's an article earlier this week that Oregon has grown 300% more than its residents can consume. And unless people are planning on burning those plants, it's going to find its way to other places. And that's where you're going to start having the problems with the feds, okay? It's compliance, compliance, compliance. Once you start crossing state lines, selling cannabis outside of the state in which it's permissible, you're going to have issues. And so, yes, these are all real-world issues to the industry.
And I would also add that we see probably some low-hanging fruit in the next 18 to 24 months for exactly the reasons why that you're alluding to.
And I would just say one more thing. If we're talking California specifically, in Prop 64, which is the governing law that we're all talking about today, you have building size, max out, right? And you have land size that, maxes out. That all goes away in 2020. So those protections to keep these startup businesses being able to acquire the land or acquire the building or lease the land or lease the building in my personal opinion, the floodgates open up for big business after 220, what happens to that, right? So the whole industry's at risk, and the whole industry's on a fuse. That's the reality. Go pick your risk.
Okay, Christine. Some of our panelists can stick around. Some have flights to catch, but we'll see how it goes.
Thank you very much. So Lubin and Olson is sponsoring a reception right after this, right through these doors, hosted bar, some snacks and hors d'oeuvres. We'd like you to stay and continue the conversation. Somebody left their cell phone outside, if somebody's missing a cell phone. Oh, good. Oh, okay. All right, thanks for joining us today.